the main character's own thoughts, he understood deeply that truly risking everything in pursuit of something was an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. Whether in work, sports, hobbies, or gambling, in the Japan of 2034, it was genuinely hard for a person to abandon all comfort and security in order to chase a single goal. He had not attended school with any consistency, and even as an adult, he had not held down regular employment in the way most people did. Instead, he had stripped his life down to the bare minimum required to keep himself alive, meaning food, sleep, and basic bodily functions, and had poured every remaining part of himself into one singular pursuit. He was simply and completely committed to reaching the very top. Not just any version of the top, but the kind of undisputed first place that was recognized by everyone in the world without question, the kind of existence that others looked upon with something close to reverence, as though the person holding that rank were something beyond ordinary. The strongest in history, someone who had never once tolerated defeat. That was him. Undisputedly, and without argument, that was who he was. He had been the world-ranked #1 player in a fully immersive virtual reality, massively multiplayer online role-playing game called Mobius Online, and he had held that position by a wide margin over everyone else. Every achievement he had accumulated, everything he had built his life around, all of it had become history on a single day. His main character, a player known as Seven, had been hacked and deleted. And it was not only his own data that had been destroyed. The offline backups were gone as well, and he was far from the only one affected. 3,000 players in total had been targeted. 3,000 high-ranking players had all had their character data wiped out in one sweep. The culprit was believed to be one of those high-ranking players themselves, and what the main character had heard suggested the person had been driven to commit the act out of envy. But there was nothing careless about what had been done. Hacking the character data of 3,000 players simultaneously was not something that happened by accident or impulse. It was the result of a deeply determined and aberrant will. The official announcement from the Mobius Online administrators had come shortly after. They stated that they were unable to restore any of the affected characters. The only compensation they could offer was a special promotional reduction on the fees associated with creating a new character. After reading this, the main character had hurled his VR headset across the room in rage and cursed out loud. No matter how many times he and others had gone to the company's head office to demand answers or push for a resolution, the administrators had given the same response every time. Eventually, he had exhausted his anger and collapsed onto his bed. He felt completely hollow. Nothing came to mind. There was nothing he wanted to do. All he could produce were sighs. He knew that his first place standing was gone and that he would never get it back. He sat up and told himself that he could not stay in this state of despair forever. And then, unexpectedly, a wide grin spread across his face. A decision formed inside him. If this was where things stood, then he would simply die. He made that decision. But when he opened his eyes, he found himself somewhere completely unexpected. He looked around slowly, and the surroundings began to feel familiar in a way that did not make immediate sense. He asked himself whether this was Mobius Online. He could not figure out when he had logged in. Then, a girl's voice cut through his confusion sharply. She was angry and told him he was blocking the way in front of her store and demanded he stop standing there in a daze. When he turned to face her, he recognized her. She was the poster girl for a store called Icicle, a character he had come to know as Ice-chan. He was familiar with her voice from his time in the game, but the way she had just spoken to him was nothing like the dialogue he had ever heard from her before. He found himself wondering whether some kind of update had been implemented while he was away from the game. Then Ice-chan's demeanor shifted abruptly. Her cheeks turned red as she looked at his face, and she stumbled over her words, apologizing and asking softly whether he had some business with her store. The sudden change from sharp hostility to flustered gentleness confused him completely. Without thinking it through, he told her she was cute. In his mind, he thought that calling it a godly update would not even be an exaggeration. The remark sent the color rushing even deeper into Ice-chan's face, and she replied in a shaky and indignant voice before ducking back inside the store. He watched from outside and thought to himself that the behavior she had just displayed was magnificent and that some kind of rapport or relationship system had almost certainly been added to the game while he had not been logged in. Then he caught a glimpse of his own reflection and stopped. It was not his main character looking back at him. It was not Seven. It was Second. He murmured the name to himself. Second was an alternate character he had created at the same time as Seven, but he had never put any time or effort into developing it. It was a mule character, something used purely for storage, with 0 experience points to its name. Finding himself inside Second's body, he let out a long sigh and told himself it was hopeless. He had no will to start Mobius Online all over again from scratch. He decided he would just log out quickly, but when he tried, nothing happened. The logout function would not respond, and he could not even bring up the settings screen. He wondered whether the game had bugged out and considered pressing the emergency stop button to return to reality. And then, slowly, a realization crept over him. A smirk formed on his lips. He had forgotten something important. There was no reality to return to anymore. He had already died, but a puzzling question remained alongside that realization. If he was dead, then why was he inside Mobius Online? He considered the possibility that his afterlife was this game world. But then something else came back to him. He remembered that even if he did say so himself, his final thoughts before dying had been genuinely pitiful ones. He had wished from the bottom of his heart that it would have been wonderful to be born into the world of Mobius Online. If given the choice, being reborn inside a game world would have been his preference above all else. Those had been his last words to himself, in a manner of speaking. He began to wonder whether those wishes had somehow come true. He pinched himself sharply, and a clear and immediate stab of pain made him gasp out loud. He was shocked. It hurt. Inside a game, it had actually hurt. If that was consistent with the way Ice-chan had spoken to him in a way that no NPC ever would, and with the fact that he could not log out, then all of it pointed to the same conclusion. If that was truly the case, then he had been reborn. Inside a game world, tears burst from his eyes without warning. He cried out repeatedly that it was the best thing that had ever happened to him and shouted his gratitude to whatever force had made it possible. He completely forgot himself and began dancing wildly in the street for nearly an hour, making strange sounds and drawing every eye around him. The joy he felt in that moment surpassed even the greatest achievement of his previous life, which had been claiming first place in the world. This feeling was dozens, hundreds, thousands of times greater than that had ever been. At that point, a guard appeared, grabbed him, and held him firmly in place, announcing that he was under arrest. The guard turned toward Ice-chan and asked whether she was certain this was the right person. Ice-chan confirmed to the guard that yes. Second had been causing a disturbance in front of her store and asked that he be taken away. Second broke into a cold sweat as he was let off. Shortly after, he found himself at the station of the Third Chivalric Order of the Kingdom of Castal. In plain terms, they were the police of this world, and Second was now seated before them being questioned. A woman across from him demanded to know why he had been behaving the way he had. Second told her he had simply gotten a little too excited about something. As he sat there, he quietly took stock of the people in front of him and the situation he was in. The woman interrogating him asked him several things in quick succession. Based on his appearance, she wanted to know whether he was a noble, which family he belonged to, why he was traveling alone, and what had happened to any companion he might have had. Second told her he was not a noble. He stole a glance at her as he said this, and privately noted that she was not merely cute, but genuinely beautiful, carrying herself with a dignified quality he found striking. He had never seen an NPC that looked like her before, which only reinforced his growing certainty that this was a real world he had been born into rather than a game he was playing. The female knight's patience ran out before he could process his thoughts further. She slammed both hands down on the table and declared that noble status carried no weight with the Third Chivalric Order. Whoever a person was, if they broke the law, it was a crime, and crimes were evil, and evil would be judged. Protecting good citizens was their duty and their definition of justice. She demanded he talk, calling him a corrupt noble and insisting she already had substantial evidence against him. Second calmly attempted to point out again that he was not a noble, but the woman cut him off before he could finish the sentence. He thought to himself that trying to reason with her was completely pointless. Then, just as abruptly as she had erupted, the female knight went calm. She said she understood, interpreting his difficulty in answering as a refusal to cooperate. She reached down and gripped the hilt of her sword, making it very clear that drawing it was an option she was prepared to consider. Second felt his nerves spike immediately and told her quickly to wait, that he would talk. The female knight released the hilt and remarked that he could have simply done that from the beginning. She then demanded his name and occupation. Second told her his name was Second and that he was an adventurer. The female knight looked at him and called him a liar outright. Second was at a loss for what to do next. She narrowed her eyes and pointed out that his clothing was far too finely tailored to belong to any adventurer. It looked expensive and carefully put together. The observation clicked something into place for Second. His equipment was the problem. It was not as extravagant as what his main character Seven had worn, but he had dressed the second character in rare clothes to make it look presentable, and that had apparently been enough to make him look like a member of the nobility to the people around him. This was genuinely bad. He knew from the game's lore that the relationship between the lower divisions of the Third Chivalric Order and the noble class was a tense and resentful one. The lower divisions had been watching the upper divisions collude openly with nobles for a long time, and the resulting bitterness had built up considerably. This female knight in front of him was clearly the type who was overflowing with a sense of justice that went beyond the average person's, and she had been feeding that resentment for some time. The problem was that Second had nothing on him to prove his actual social standing, and he had no idea what to do about it. The female knight's voice rose again as she demanded to know what he was scheming. Her words stopped mid-sentence when a man walked into the room. Without any greeting or preamble, he reached out and gave the female knight a firm but light knock on the head with his fist, calling her by name, Sylvia, and saying she was an absolute dimwit. He glanced at Second, apologized on her behalf, and said he would be taking over the questioning. Second nodded in response. The man apologized to him properly and explained that since Second was suspected of deliberately obstructing business, he would need to ask him a few things. He asked Second to briefly explain his social status and his intentions in the area. Second gave his name and stated that he was 17 years old and worked as an adventurer. Privately, he reflected on the reality of the situation. His actual name was Satsuo Shikaru. He was 28 years old, single, and unemployed in the world he had come from. But 17 was the age he had entered for this character when creating it, and so that was the answer he gave. The man said he understood and then brought up what the witnesses had reported, specifically that Second had been dancing and making strange sounds in front of the grocery store icicle for an extended period of time. He asked why Second had been doing that. Second explained that he had unintentionally zoned out and offered his apologies. The man noted that Second was therefore confessing to the behavior, and then asked what his intentions had been. Second told him he had not planned to cause any trouble for the store and that he had no particular intentions in mind at the time. Internally, Second thought to himself that this whole exchange was genuinely humiliating. Somehow the experience had made it fully real to him that he was now living inside a proper functioning society with rules and consequences. The man sighed and asked Second to confirm that he was claiming he had not deliberately obstructed the store's business. Second said yes. After the matter was settled, he paid compensation to the grocery store icicle and was released. Once he was free, Second stood outside and tried to take stock of his situation. The compensation he had paid had come to 150,000 CL. He thought about that number and realized it was not even enough to buy armor that would keep him from looking like a complete beginner. At the moment, he had a little over 2 billion CL on hand. Without wasting any time, he had already changed out of the rare clothes that had caused all the misunderstanding into something more neutral, and he had purchased a solid set of full body armor as well. The combined total he had spent came to 2,300,000 CL. Whether that was considered expensive or cheap in this world, he genuinely had no way of knowing yet. Something about the prices here already felt different from the Mobius Online he had known. This meant that understanding the actual value of currency in this world needed to become one of his first priorities. Just as he was thinking this, his stomach let out a loud and insistent growl. The timing was perfect in its own way. Getting a meal would serve the double purpose of eating and helping him figure out prices, since the cost of a meal or a night's accommodation would give him a practical baseline to work from. He spotted an establishment nearby that looked suitable and thought it would do. He believed from the outside that it had a bar on the ground floor. He went straight in, and a young woman stepped forward to welcome him. He asked her how much it was for a single night's stay. The woman did not respond right away. She simply stood there and stared at him for a brief and slightly awkward moment. Second waited and then asked again. She suddenly seemed to come back to herself, stumbling over an apology. She repeated his question back to him in a fumbling way, trying to collect her thoughts and find her answer. In the back of his mind, Second noticed that this was not the first time he had gotten this kind of reaction from someone. Ice-chan had behaved in a similarly flustered way when they had first met, and now this receptionist girl was acting strangely as well. He waited, and eventually she managed to pull herself together. She told him the cost for a single night, which included both breakfast and dinner, came to 7,000 CL. Without meals, it would be 4,000 CL. Second was genuinely surprised by how inexpensive that sounded. Then something else struck him immediately afterward. If a single night's accommodation was that cheap, then the full body armor he had purchased earlier must have been of an extraordinarily high quality level, far beyond what he had initially assumed. He made his decision on the spot. He would stay for 5 nights without meals included. The girl replied quickly and handed him his room key. As their hands made brief contact during the exchange, she froze completely, and in an instant her face turned a deep shade of red. Second looked at her with genuine puzzlement. He could not quite make sense of the reaction and found himself wondering what was going on. A short while later, he made his way to a pub and took a seat by himself. He sat quietly and let his eyes drift casually around the room. It did not take long for him to notice that several girls in the establishment were stealing glances in his direction when they thought he was not looking. And then it clicked. He finally understood what was happening. He stood out enormously, and not in the way he had earlier with his noble-looking clothing. This was something different entirely. The reason was his avatar. Before everything had happened, he had set up a limited-time premium avatar designed to be exceptionally beautiful in appearance. In the context of an online game, even a beautiful character would rarely draw much attention from anyone. But in a real world where that appearance existed as an actual physical presence rather than pixels on a screen, the effect was something else entirely. The girls looking his way were doing so with a kind of warmth and interest that made the difference very clear. Second sat with a smug satisfaction settling over him as he thought about this. In this body, in this world, the reality of where he was and what it meant was becoming more and more tangible to him. A pleasant shiver ran along his spine, and a smile found its way onto his face before he had even thought to put it there. The effort he put into things here would not be wasted or meaningless. There would be no ceiling above him in this world, no invisible boundary saying he had gone as far as he could go. Then the voices from before he had been reborn began drifting back through his mind, one after another. Someone had told him that no matter how hard he worked in an online game, it was completely pointless. Another voice had told him to come back to reality and stop wasting time. Someone else had insisted that becoming the #1 player in the world inside a game meant absolutely nothing of value. Others had pressed him to attend school properly, to find real work, to think seriously about what kind of future he was building for himself. Those voices had followed him throughout the life he had left behind. But here, in this world, all of those arguments dissolved into nothing. everything that had felt like a reasonable point in the life he had come from, and everything that had sat like a deep and unresolved dissatisfaction in the very bottom of his heart had been completely stripped of its power. A small laugh slipped out of him, and then it grew, and before long he was laughing openly and without restraint. Second lifted his head and looked out at the world around him with eyes full of clear and steady resolve. His decision was made. He was going to become the number one in the world again. The next morning, Second woke up with a groan of pain. He had gotten completely carried away the night before, and drinking large amounts of alcohol he was not accustomed to had been a poor decision, even if the occasion had been the perfectly reasonable one of celebrating his rebirth into a parallel world. He was paying for it now with a proper hangover. He pushed himself upright and began thinking through what he needed to do. This place was no longer the interior of a game. It was reality to him now, which meant that everything needed to be approached with that understanding. In Mobius Online, there were many skills that were considered absolutely necessary for any serious player. Going without them was simply not an option. The core structure of the game was built around an experience point system, which meant that earning experience was the foundation of everything else. Skills required experience to be learned, and stats required experience to be raised. That made earning experience the first and most important priority above everything else. The way to earn experience was straightforward. A player either defeated monsters or completed quests. The skills available in the game spanned an enormous range of categories, covering all manner of combat techniques, magical abilities, and crafting disciplines. Every skill had its own established ranking structure. The rankings ran from the 16th class at the lowest level all the way up through to the first class, and above that there were 9 grades of ascending quality. Beyond even those graded rankings, there existed a special category known as a title rank. Advancing through any of these rankings also required experience points, and the way a character's stats grew over time depended entirely on the growth type that had been selected when the character was originally created. Shortly after waking and working through all of this in his head, Second made his way down to the bar on the ground floor. He asked the nearby waitress for a serving of curry rice. She welcomed him warmly. Completely unaware of the steady stream of glances being directed his way from around the room, Second settled into his thoughts while he waited for the food. Something came back to him as he sat there. He recalled the growth type assigned to this character, Second. It was the same growth type he had used for his main character 7, which was the all-rounder type. An all-rounder was fundamentally different from a specialized character in terms of how its stats developed, where a specialized type would see certain stats climb steeply while others fell behind, producing an uneven and stretched distribution of abilities. An all-rounder stats grew evenly and consistently across every category at the same time, without any deviation. The upside of this was considerable. A perfectly balanced character suited someone aiming to reach the absolute top, which was exactly what Second had in mind. The downside, however, was equally real. Being a jack of all trades meant being a master of none, particularly during the early stages of development. The waitress returned with his order and apologized for making him wait. Second continued, turning everything over in his mind as he ate. The initial development period for an all-rounder type was significantly more demanding than for other growth types, requiring far more concentrated effort before the advantages of the build started to pay off. Given all of that, there was only one way through the early stage. He had no choice but to use that method, the one he had already been turning over in his mind. After finishing breakfast, Second made his way directly to a potion specialty store. He walked straight up to the counter and asked the staff to provide him with every bottle they had of a specific item, a high-tier potion that combined detoxifying, dispelling, and recovery effects all in a single bottle. The 2 staff members standing behind the counter went completely silent. The older of the 2 eventually managed to find his voice and told Second with some hesitation that if they included everything held in storage, the total would amount to an extraordinary sum of money. Second ignored the warning entirely and simply asked how many bottles they currently had in stock. The old man told him they had close to 630. Second told him to bring all of them. Both staff members were stunned. The potions in question were enhanced versions of a standard high potion, strengthened 2 steps beyond the baseline and carrying detoxifying, dispelling, and recovery properties combined in each bottle. Each one was priced at 120,000 CL, multiplied across 630 bottles. The total came to 75,600,000 CL. Once they had recovered from the initial shock, the man moved efficiently to bring everything out and apologize for the delay. Second paid the full amount in cash and packed every single bottle into his inventory without hesitation. Before walking out the door, he added that he would need approximately 9,000 additional bottles on top of what he had just purchased and asked them to restock accordingly. The 2 staff members were left standing there with their mouths hanging open for the second time in the same visit. The strategy behind all of his purchases was something Second had carried forward from his extensive knowledge of the game. It was a method that had been known within the Mobius Online player community as the DK tactic, a cheat-level approach to accumulating experience in the very early stages of a character's development. The concept had originally been inspired by an old 8-bit game called Dinosaur Quest, in which players would throw fixed damage items at enemies with high evasion rates in order to defeat them and collect the resulting experience. Second had adapted that same underlying logic to Mobius Online with a very specific application in mind. The potions he had just purchased, enhanced versions combining detoxify, dispel, and recovery effects, possessed an additional property that most players either overlooked or did not know about. When used against undead-type enemies, each bottle dealt a fixed damage of 1,200 points on impact. That amount was precisely calibrated to be enough to whittle away the health of a mid-level undead monster known as the Viper Zombie, a creature notable for offering a relatively generous amount of experience points even by the standards of undead enemies. In practical terms, this meant that by simply throwing these bottles at Viper Zombies, even someone with absolutely no combat skill, even a young child, could defeat them reliably and accumulate experience at a consistent pace. The reason this method had remained obscure and rarely used was its cost. Earning a meaningful and sufficient amount of experience through this approach required a minimum of 10,000 potions, which translated to a total expenditure of 1.2 billion CL. The only people capable of assembling that kind of money without any real difficulty were those who had a well-developed main character already generating significant income on the side. As a result, the DK tactic had remained the exclusive tool of high-level players using it specifically for the development of their alternate characters. It was also critical to understand that the method had a strict ceiling on its usefulness. It was an exceptionally efficient way to push through the early stages of development, but it became completely unworkable once a character reached intermediate level. It was designed for the very beginning and served no purpose beyond that point. With everything from the potion store settled and packed away, Second headed to the stables to purchase a horse. Second looked over the horses available and chose the black one without hesitation, deciding on the spot to name it Seventh Tayo. He smirked to himself at the thought that the day had actually come when he would need to resort to a method like this. With his horse and supplies in order, he set off and began making his way toward his destination. He eventually arrived at a cave and left his horse outside before heading in on foot. As he walked through the interior, he reflected on the journey. He had already covered nearly 2 hours of ground on horseback from the royal capital. He was fairly certain that a well-known hunting ground existed here, inside a large cave positioned behind a mine in this area. When he looked around, he confirmed it, but he also noticed something else. There was not a single other person anywhere in sight. He considered a few possible explanations for this. Perhaps the DK tactic had not yet been discovered or thought of by anyone in this world. Or perhaps the high cost of the necessary potions made it completely inaccessible to most people. Or perhaps there simply were not many beginners attempting to farm experience at all. Whatever the reason, the absence of other people suited him perfectly. He could hunt at his own pace without any interference or competition whatsoever. He looked around for a short while longer and then found what he had come for. A Viper Zombie sensed his presence and turned to face him. Second shuddered involuntarily with disgust the moment he laid eyes on it. Seeing the creature in real life was an entirely different experience from encountering it in a game. It looked 100 times more revolting in person. He pushed the feeling aside and forced himself to focus on getting through it as quickly as possible. He moved behind a rock, carefully peeked out to keep the monster in view, and began throwing potions at it one after another. Each bottle shattered on impact with a sharp crack, and the Viper Zombie was defeated instantly. Second felt a quiet satisfaction rise in him. There was something oddly pleasing about it that he had not expected. After clearing the first spot, he moved on to the next hunting ground and repeated the same process there. Then he moved to the next after that, and continued cycling through them in a continuous loop. By the time he returned to the first location, the Viper Zombies would have respawned and were ready to be cleared again. He kept this pattern going without stopping or resting, throwing potions in an unbroken and methodical rhythm, one bottle after another, until finally all 630 bottles had been used up. The total experience he had accumulated from the session was a solid and workable amount. If he maintained this kind of output, it would not be very long before he had gathered nearly all of the core skills he needed and had begun advancing his skill rankings upward as well. He felt good about the progress. At some point during all of this, he had completely lost track of time. He noticed with mild annoyance that the sun had gone down while he was not paying attention. He cursed quietly to himself, mounted his horse, and rode back along the same route he had come. He eventually came to a stop when the walls and lights of the royal capital came into view. He decided the rest of the evening would be straightforward. He would eat, get drunk, take a bath, and then sleep. That was the plan. Then a familiar voice called out toward him. The moment Second heard it, a sense that something unpleasant was coming settled over him immediately. He was fairly certain the voice belonged to the dense but undeniably striking female knight from the previous day, the one whose name he thought was Sylvia. He climbed down from his horse and thanked her casually for the interaction the day before. Sylvia responded in a grumpy and suspicious tone, recognizing him as the troublesome Second from the day before and demanding to know what he was doing out at this hour of the night. Second met her doubtful gaze and understood he was being questioned again. He told her simply that he had been spending some time at the mines. Sylvia repeated this back to him with clear disbelief, asking what on earth he would have been doing at the mines. He explained that he had gone to earn experience in a large cave located behind them. Sylvia narrowed her eyes further, her expression making it obvious that she did not believe a word of it. She told him flatly that if he was going to lie, he should at least put more effort into making the lie sound plausible. The idea that someone would deliberately travel to a place that dangerous just for the purpose of defeating monsters made no sense to her whatsoever. Second frowned at her response and asked what exactly she meant by that. He added, thinking about the experience the Viper zombies had yielded, that he had found them quite rewarding to deal with. Sylvia looked at him with a flat and unimpressed expression and said that she understood the situation now, concluding that he either had no common sense at all or that something in his thinking was fundamentally not working as it should. Second thought to himself that she was genuinely irritating in a way that was hard to fully ignore. Then something caught in his mind. He stopped and turned it over. She had referred to the location as dangerous. He came back to her and said he had a question he wanted to ask if she did not mind. She told him to go ahead. Second asked her about the dungeons in this world. In his memory, Mobius Online had 21 dungeons in total, locations that players treated as the ultimate challenges worth pooling all of their collective knowledge and effort to explore. Each one had been studied and mapped and strategized over in meticulous detail. He asked Sylvia whether there were 21 dungeons here. Sylvia looked at him as though the question made little sense and told him there were 19. Second processed this quietly. He had suspected as much. He followed up immediately with another question, asking how many of those 19 were currently being actively rated. Sylvia gave him a puzzled look before answering that 13 of them were, clearly treating this as obvious information that any reasonable person would already know. Second went silent for a brief moment. He told her he understood, thanked her, and asked whether he was free to go. She told him to hurry along, and he continued on his way without saying anything further. The full picture had become clear to him now. In this world, death was permanent and absolute. There was no respawning, no recovery, no second chance after being killed. That single fact changed the entire landscape of how people approached becoming stronger. Because dying here meant everything was truly over. There were not many people in this world willing or desperate enough to put their actual lives on the line repeatedly in pursuit of power or strength. Most people held back. Most people were cautious. That was why dungeons remained unexplored. That was why the cave behind the mine had been deserted. That was why only 13 of 19 dungeons were being raided at all. And yet Second already held inside his mind every piece of strategic knowledge and detailed information about this world's dungeons and systems that other people would have to risk their lives thousands or even tens of thousands of times to piece together on their own. Every mechanic, every trick, every dungeon layout and monster weakness and hidden advantage that existed within Mobius Online was already sitting in his memory, ready to be used. A smile spread slowly and steadily across his face. He smirked to himself with quiet certainty. At this rate, reaching the #1 position in the world might come even sooner than he had originally planned. The next morning, Second set out again with a clear destination already in mind. He had determined that once a certain threshold of experience had been accumulated, the next place he needed to visit was the Grand Royal Library. The reason for going to a library rather than continuing to hunt monsters came down to a specific aspect of how skill acquisition worked in Mobius Online. There were primarily 2 conditions required for learning new skills in the game, and the first of those conditions was reading skill books. The Grand Royal Library happened to contain a large number of these skill books, making it an essential stop in his overall plan. When he arrived and stepped inside, a librarian approached him politely and asked what he was looking for. Second's eyes briefly drifted downward before he told her he was fine and did not need assistance. The librarian accepted this and left him to browse on his own. Second began scanning the room. He reminded himself that the requirement was simply to flip through the pages of the relevant books rather than read them in full, which meant he could move through the shelf at a reasonably quick pace and cover more ground efficiently. He found the first book he was looking for without too much difficulty. His plan for this visit was to acquire 2 fundamental skills, one from the field of swordsmanship and one from archery, as well as 4 specific elemental skills from a category in sorcery, known as the Ichi no Kata, or the Oppo form. He was aware that the range of combat skills available in Mobius Online was extensive, covering not just swordsmanship and archery, but also disciplines such as spearmanship, unarmed combat, and shieldmanship. For each of these major combat skill categories, there were 9 distinct minor skills arranged in a specific order, named after traditional game pieces: pawn, spear, knight, silver general, gold general, bishop, castle, promoted bishop, and promoted rook. For this particular visit, his focus was on acquiring the pawn and spear minor skills from both swordsmanship and archery, giving him 4 skills in total from those 2 categories. He worked through them without encountering any difficulty. With those secured, he moved on to sorcery. In Mobius Online, sorcery was divided into 4 elemental categories: fire, water, wind, and earth. Within each element, there were 5 forms of increasing complexity named the Oppo, Raptor, Coeurl, 4th, and 5th forms. He looked through the grimoires available in the Grand Royal Library and found that the selection matched what had been available in Mobius Online during his time there. Only the 4 elemental Oppo forms were held here. He assumed that the more advanced grimoires would need to be obtained elsewhere, most likely from the Royal School of Magic or as rewards from completing high-difficulty quests. He filed that away as something to address later and finished acquiring all 4 of the Oppo forms without any trouble. With everything he had come for now in hand, Second decided to head back. On his way out, he spotted the librarian from earlier stumbling and falling to the ground after accidentally bumping into a man. Second narrowed his eyes at the sight of it, but then shook the thought off and continued walking. He reflected that the library had yielded an abundant and satisfying harvest of knowledge and skills. He turned his attention to the steps ahead and began laying out his training sequence in order. The first step was to earn experience while maintaining a degree of personal safety by fighting at range using archery. The second step was to solidify his position and build reliable damage output through swordsmanship, which was both effective and relatively straightforward to apply in most situations. The third step was to prepare powerful trump cards for more difficult enemies by developing his high-damage sorcery capabilities. The fourth step involved conjuration. When Second had created this alternate character and purchased the limited-time premium avatar, a special item called a premium spirit ticket had been included. When used, this ticket significantly increased the probability of summoning a rare spirit, and there was no good reason to let that advantage go to waste. However, conjuration had clear limitations as a primary method of combat and was best treated as a supporting auxiliary skill rather than a central one. This meant it was better to begin developing it after archery, swordsmanship, and sorcery had each been brought up to a satisfactory level first. With his plan firmly decided, Second began allocating the experience points he had accumulated to raise the ranks of the skills he had just acquired. The weapon shop came to mind as he worked through the numbers. He muttered through his decisions as he went, reasoning that for archery, he would raise it just enough to be functional in battle. For the Oppo form of sorcery, he would push it to the 5th class, so that casting time would be meaningfully reduced, and for the pawn level of swordsmanship, he would invest just enough to give himself a reliable fallback option for the moments when close-quarters combat became unavoidable. Once he had distributed the experience points to bring each skill up to those levels, he had used up what was available. He decided that would do for now. The fundamental skills were in place, and, if more were needed down the line, another visit to the Grand Royal Library would be easy enough to arrange. With the immediate skill setup handled, Second turned his focus to the longer-term picture for archery specifically. The pawn and spear minor skills were just the beginning. To develop archery properly, virtually all of the other minor skills needed to be learned as well, including the knight, silver general, gold general, bishop, and castle levels. Each of these came with its own distinct special ability. The knight archery granted a precise shot capability. The silver general archery provided a powerful single-target strike. The gold general archery offered a spread strike that also carried a knockback effect. The bishop archery delivered a powerful piercing strike, and the castle archery granted an extremely powerful single-target strike that sat at the top of the damage range. Among all of these, the three most essential were the knight archery, the gold general archery, and the castle archery. Acquiring just those three alone would expand the number of available combat strategies by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, completely transforming what he was capable of doing in any given fight. However, the remaining archery skills his Second needed to acquire were fundamentally different from the basic pawn and spear skills he had already learned. Those had been obtainable simply by reading the relevant books, but what came next required a different approach entirely. Second made his way to the weapon shop and purchased a longbow. As he walked out with it, his thoughts continued working through the details. The second condition for acquiring skills in Mobius Online was completing skill quests. Importantly, though, fulfilling either of the 2 acquisition conditions did not actually require formally accepting any official quest. He simply needed to meet the specific conditions through his own actions in the field. He set out and began working through the requirements one by one on horseback. He killed a single monster cleanly while mounted and moving, and the moment the condition was met, a new skill appeared in his roster. He had learned knight archery. He continued riding and began picking off monsters one after another at a steady pace, landing a clean single shot on each without stopping, and after 20 consecutive kills in that manner, he earned another skill. Silver general archery had been acquired. He then shifted his approach and killed 10 monsters in rapid succession at close range, staying within 3 meters of each target as he did so, and learned gold general archery as the condition was fulfilled. Bishop archery was a step more demanding than the others. It required 2 separate conditions to be met rather than 1. He needed to kill 5 monsters simultaneously using the spear archery technique, and separately he needed to kill 2 monsters at the same time at a distance of at least 25 meters using a combination of spear archery and knight archery together. He worked through both conditions methodically and eventually fulfilled them, adding bishop archery to his growing list of acquired skills. The last one remaining was castle archery, and it was in a category of its own when it came to both power and the effort required to learn it. Even at its lowest ranking, the 16th class, castle archery was capable of delivering a single strike that output 250% of the user's pure firepower. If raised all the way to the 9th grade at the top of the ranking system, that multiplier climbed to an extraordinary 600%. It was the most practically powerful single-strike skill available within the archery discipline, offering enormous damage output in the most accessible form the archery tree had. However, the conditions required to learn it were among the worst of any skill in the entire game. If all the tedious acquisition conditions for all the other skills were combined into one list, castle archery would likely still rank in the bottom 10 for difficulty. The first two conditions were manageable in the long run. He needed to kill 1,000 monsters using silver general archery, and he needed to land 500 critical hits using silver general archery. These were the kind of numbers that would naturally accumulate over time as he continued fighting, so they were not a serious concern on their own. The real problem was the third and final condition. He needed to kill 3 monsters in a row that had each already attacked and drained at least 50% of another player's health points, hitting each one from at least 5 meters away with a single shot using a combination of knight archery and silver general archery. And if he failed even once during those 3 consecutive shots, the entire attempt reset from the beginning. Second found the condition exhausting just thinking about it. He cursed it internally as something close to pure suffering. He thought through the problem carefully. If this had still been the inside of an online game, he could have simply asked friends or other players to allow their health to be drained down to the halfway point and then hold still, which would have made the condition relatively straightforward to complete. But this was the real world now. A situation where a person's health had been reduced by 50% meant they were in genuine and serious danger of losing their life. Asking anyone to willingly enter that kind of situation was not something that could reasonably be done. It was completely futile even to consider. He then wondered whether it might be possible to engineer such a situation indirectly, to arrange circumstances in which it happened naturally 3 times in a row. He pushed that thought away almost immediately. No, that was even more futile and far too dark to pursue. But he genuinely wanted castle archery. It was not optional. It was an absolutely indispensable skill for anyone serious about archery as a combat discipline. After sitting with the problem for a moment longer, Second reluctantly made peace with the reality of the situation. He would simply have to accept it and fill that gap in his skill set with something else for now. He decided quietly to let the first 2 conditions, the 1,000 silver general kills and the 500 critical hits, continue accumulating passively in the background while he waited for an opportunity to present itself naturally. That opportunity arrived in a way he had not anticipated. It had been 1 week since his reincarnation into this world. He had made full use of the DK tactic and had also raised his other skill rankings to a solid level across the board. He had decided it was time to shift his focus to swordsmanship and begin developing that skill set next. He was making his way through a forested area when a loud scream cut through the trees from somewhere nearby. A man's voice followed it, rough and desperate, declaring that he would cut a path through whatever was in front of him. The words were cut short before he could finish. Second moved quietly and hid himself in the bushes to see what was happening. From his concealed position, he looked out at the scene unfolding before him. Scarlet mantises. A group of them were engaged with a party of humans. The reality of what he was witnessing hit him in a way that Mobius Online had never prepared him for. This was not the clean and structured experience of fighting inside a game. There were people breathing hard, the metallic sound of weapons clashing, the smell of earth and something heavier, the sight of blood, and the sounds of fear and screaming from real human beings. It was nothing like the world he had known. Second counted the people on the ground. 5 of them had fallen and were not moving at all. 5 others were still standing, swords drawn, having formed a tight, circular formation to try to protect one another. Even so, the situation was deteriorating fast. At the current rate, those remaining 5 would be overwhelmed and killed as well. A thought flashed through Second's mind, and a grin crossed his lips before he could stop it. 5 people. Their health must already be significantly reduced. This might be exactly the kind of situation he needed to finally fulfill the last condition for castle archery. He held the thought for just a moment, wondering whether he should wait until their health dropped further to make the condition more certain. Then it struck him, hard and clearly. He gritted his teeth. He could feel the pull of the opportunity, but what he was considering was wrong. These are not players. They were people, real people, the same as him, living in the same real world he now inhabited. They had things they were fighting for, things they had risked their lives to pursue and had not yet finished. And now they were on the verge of losing everything all over again. He could not allow that to continue happening in front of him. That kind of despair was something he understood intimately, and he could not stand by and let it reach them. Without any further hesitation, Second stepped out of the bushes and into the open, his longbow gripped firmly in his hands. He called out to the warriors still on their feet and told them to get down. They turned toward him in surprise, and then the urgency in his voice and posture snapped them into action. The warning was passed quickly among them, and the group dropped. Second did not waste a single moment. He activated his spear archery at the 5th grade level and released a precisely calculated arrow. It struck its targets with exact placement, and the monsters were defeated instantly. The warriors stood in stunned and complete silence, staring at what had just happened in front of them. The knights who had survived the encounter stood in a state of shock, and among them was Sylvia. Her eyes were wide as she stared at Second, completely unable to look away. Something about the way he had rushed in during that desperate moment struck her deeply. The figure he had cut as he emerged from the bushes and acted without hesitation reminded her of something she had only heard about, the kind of presence associated with the world's #1. She found herself thinking that there was a gallantness to how he had moved that she had not expected from him at all. Her first impression of Second had been absolutely terrible. She had written him off entirely as a young noble boy who had grown up in comfort and privilege, someone who had never known real hardship, lacked any meaningful common sense, and went through life without giving a second thought to the trouble he caused others. And yet, what she had just witnessed had completely dismantled that assumption. That same man had eliminated 6 scarlet mantises in no more than 20 seconds, using nothing but an ordinary longbow and an almost unbelievable level of skill in archery. She found herself asking how much concentrated and intense learning must lie behind that kind of ability. And then she turned the question on herself. She had devoted herself to the path of the night from a very young age, advancing through everything with only a single blade in hand. But in her own estimation, it had never been enough. No matter what she did or how hard she pushed, it had never been enough. Her own family had mocked her for lacking talent with the sword. When she had finally managed to join the Third Chivalric Order, she had found herself at the very bottom of its hierarchy, in the division that was treated as the least important and held to the most relaxed standards. Her real strength had never once been recognized or given room to be shown. To the people around her, she was just a young woman who constantly bothered them about justice, someone to be tolerated and dismissed. And even the justice she fought for was something she could never actually enforce. Every time she attempted to expose or pursue a noble for wrongdoing, her superiors would pressure her into backing down. She had come to feel a deep and bitter contempt for those in positions of power who behaved like obedient dogs to the nobility above them. And now, even in this moment, with several of her comrades lying dead on the ground, the corrupt upper ranks of the Chivalric Order were frantically trying to bring Second into their organization for their own purposes. Sylvia clenched her fist. She looked at what was happening around her and asked herself whether this was truly what the Chivalric Order was. Whether this was the image of the knight she had spent her whole life yearning for and striving toward. If it was, then she had already arrived at an answer she did not want to face. Meanwhile, somewhere in the town, a conversation was taking place between Second and an older man from the Chivalric Order. The man asked whether Second had any interest in joining the Adventurers Guild. Second repeated the question back with mild irritation. He had assumed that after everything that had just happened, the first thing out of the man's mouth would be an expression of gratitude. Instead, the man had opened with this. The man apologized and acknowledged that he had jumped ahead too quickly. He then mentioned that he had heard Second was an adventurer who was not affiliated with any guild. Second said nothing out loud in response. Internally, he confirmed to himself that this was accurate. He had no guild affiliation, and as far as he was concerned, there was no compelling reason to have one. The Kingdom of Castal's Adventurers Guild was an organization that coordinated and executed requests such as monster subjugation. But beneath that surface purpose, it functioned as a tool that allowed the kingdom to unilaterally control adventurers by gaining access to their personal information. Second knew this not because he had discovered it himself, but because it had been recorded in the lore and stories that made up the world of Mobius Online. He gave the man his answer. He thanked him, but respectfully declined. The man expressed mild surprise and said he had not thought it was a bad offer. Second told him plainly that money was not a concern for him, and that he had no interest in being tied down by any organization. The man scratched his head and seemed to consider saying something further, but stopped himself. Second asked what it was. The man told him it was nothing, but continued by saying that the Chivalric Order could not afford to let an exceptional freelance adventurer of Second's caliber simply go unaccounted for. The incident earlier had made his true strength very apparent to everyone present. In a situation like this, the man said those in positions of privilege had become very eager to bring Second into their sphere of influence. Second asked whether the man was essentially saying the Adventurers Guild would be providing him protection. The man confirmed that was the idea. Second smiled outwardly, but found the entire proposal deeply suspicious in his own mind. He had been told that his true strength had been made plain, but the only people who had witnessed what he could do were the members of the Third Chivalric Order themselves. Why were they so determined to get him affiliated with the guild? He could not shake the feeling that agreeing to it would simply become a weight around his neck and hold him back from reaching the #1 position in the world. He told the man he would be declining the affiliation after all. The man said he understood, but then added something unexpected. He said that in that case, he would have Sylvia accompany Second going forward. With a member of the Third Chivalric Order at his side, they would at least be able to keep a reasonable degree of awareness of his movements and activities. At the mere mention of Sylvia's name, Second felt a shiver run through him. The man continued, saying that he was not sure what means would convince someone of Second's apparent noble standing to agree to anything, but that Sylvia had a reputation throughout the royal capital for being exceptionally strict when it came to dealing with nobles. He thought she would be a reasonable choice to keep tabs on Second without overstepping. He asked what Second thought of the arrangement. Second furrowed his brow slightly as he thought it through. The old man's persistence in pushing Sylvia forward was not something he had expected, and the implications of it were interesting. Sylvia was known for being hard on nobles, and the upper ranks of the Chivalric Order were closely tied to the nobility. That meant Sylvia was almost certainly a thorn in the side of those same upper ranks. In other words, the chivalric order likely saw getting her out of their way as a convenient side benefit of this arrangement. If that was true, then what was being offered to Second was actually quite favorable. He would gain a highly capable female knight as a companion at no cost to himself, and the chivalric order would simultaneously remove someone who troubled them. He asked the old man how long the escort arrangement would last. The old man told him to ask Sylvia directly. At that moment, Sylvia arrived wearing her casual clothes rather than her armor. Second found his eyes staying on her. The old man addressed Sylvia and told her that from this point forward, she would be taking on the responsibility of serving as Second's escort. The length of the arrangement, he added, would be decided with consideration for both her and Second's views on the matter. Sylvia heard this, and her expression shifted with visible surprise. Second said nothing out loud, but thought to himself that her reaction was understandable. What had just been handed to her was, in practical terms, a demotion. And the old man's claim about respecting Sylvia's opinion in determining the length of the arrangement was hollow, because the phrasing itself made clear that it was entirely within the old man's power to decide it with a single word regardless. The chivalric order's low regard for Sylvia was becoming increasingly obvious. The old man then asked Sylvia whether she had any particular preferences regarding the length of her term. Left with no real choice, Sylvia said yes quietly, her fist pressed against her chest. At that same moment, Second realized he had been unable to take his eyes off her again. He caught the old man looking at him with a knowing expression and cleared his throat. He proposed 2 years as the length of the arrangement. In his mind, 2 years was the right amount of time. It was more than enough for him to chase down and reach the #1 position in the world. The old man agreed without any hesitation whatsoever. And just like that, the female knight Sylvia became Second's official escort. After the meeting concluded, the old man spoke privately with Sylvia for a short while, but Sylvia's mind was not fully present in the conversation. She could not stop herself from thinking about what had just happened. She had been demoted. The chivalric order had found a way to quietly get rid of someone they considered dead weight, and she was that someone. Sylvia was the second daughter of the Knight Order of Virginia. In her family, becoming a knight and proving oneself in battle was considered a sacred duty. Yet for Sylvia, this path had always been a painful and fruitless one. She had no natural gift for the sword, and because of this, she was looked down upon by everyone around her, including her older brother, her sister, and even her own parents, who all saw her as a failure. Despite this, she eventually managed to become a knight, though even that achievement brought her little peace. Her thoughts were interrupted when Second suddenly proposed that the two of them make a deal. In the back of her mind, Sylvia suspected that the old man had probably sent her to charm Second into joining the chivalric order. Still, his sudden suggestion came as a complete shock to her, and she could not quite understand why he was bringing it up. Given how many overwhelming things had happened that day, her mind was already stretched thin. Even so, she told him she would hear him out, not fully realizing that agreeing to listen would set her life on a completely different path forever. Second began by saying that he understood she wanted to serve with pride as a knight. As he spoke, Sylvia found herself distracted by the way he said her name directly, and her heart gave a small, unexpected flutter. He was strikingly handsome, and though she had never allowed herself to be caught up in romantic feelings before, always pouring every bit of herself in her training, sitting here with meat in hand, something soft and unfamiliar was stirring inside her. Second then laid out the heart of his proposal. He told her that if she was truly fed up with the way things were, she should make the firm decision to leave the Third Chivalric Order entirely. And on top of that, he asked if she would go out with him. Sylvia's face turned bright red, and she could barely find her words. Second quickly reassured her that he was speaking in terms of a deal, not anything else. Sylvia forced herself to settle down, reminding herself firmly that this was a business arrangement and nothing more, then drank the rest of her cup in one swift motion to steady herself. Once she was a little calmer, Second went on. He told her that he figured she could not stand being crushed under corrupt authority, and that the solution was simply to build up enough power to stand against it, something he had the means to help her achieve. Sylvia's expression grew serious. She told him that for 13 years, starting from when she was just 4 years old, she had devoted herself entirely to the sword, and yet in all that time, she had not managed to carry out even a single act of justice. A heavy silence settled between them. Second scratched his head and gently pointed out that if the sword was not working for her, perhaps she ought to try a different weapon entirely, like a spear or a bow. Sylvia's eyes went wide. In a burst of anger, she grabbed him by the collar. She was furious, thinking about just how much she had sacrificed and endured. But then, in the middle of her rage, something shifted inside her. She let go of him. She finally admitted to herself that he was right. She had become so stubborn. Despite people telling her again and again that she lacked the talent for the sword, she had kept going, refusing to change course. In her mind, a knight had always been a specific image. Someone in shining armor, carrying a sword, riding a horse, and rushing in bravely when people were in danger. She had always dreamed of becoming that kind of knight. A great one. Someone who stood firmly against evil no matter what. Tears began to gather in her eyes, and she whispered to herself that it was all rather pitiful. Second told her plainly to stop forcing herself into a shape that did not fit her. He reminded her that a weapon was just a weapon, and that what truly mattered was being the kind of person who runs toward trouble when others need help. Sylvia sat quietly with his words, knowing he was right. There was no need to be tied to any particular image. And then, without meaning to, the image of Second flashed through her mind, the moment he had rushed in to save them, and her eyes filled with something close to awe. After a long moment, Sylvia made up her mind. She told him she would go out with him. A pleased smile slowly spread across Second's face. Sylvia stared at him for just a second before her cheeks went red again, and she quickly looked away. Second then told her he wanted to share his dream with her. With great energy and conviction, he described his goal of becoming the best in the world, no matter what it took. It was an enormous, almost absurd dream, Sylvia thought, the kind that could easily be laughed at. But the way he talked about it, with bright, sparkling eyes and a smile like a child who had just discovered something wonderful, made it impossible to dismiss. She found herself wanting to go along with him, certain that whatever came next would be anything but dull. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of lightness. Her future, which had seemed so dim, suddenly felt full of possibility. Later that night, after their conversation ended, they each returned to their separate rooms. Second sat down on his bed, and the quiet smile on his face slowly grew until it became open laughter that rang out beyond the walls of his room. He had not expected things to go quite so smoothly. He knew that drawing in a heartbroken young woman with a rather cunning approach was not exactly the most honorable tactic, but he genuinely believed it would end up being good for her as well. Turning it over in his mind, he reasoned that Sylvia, having trained with the sword for 13 years and still showing almost no progress, likely had natural strengths that lay somewhere entirely different. Perhaps in archery, or perhaps in sorcery. Her growth type was probably tied to dexterity or intelligence, or possibly she was even suited to a production role. Whatever the case, he was not too worried about the details. What mattered most to him in that moment was that he had gained a companion. Having someone fighting alongside him would make him far more secure in battle. On top of that, he had managed to steer Sylvia away from her difficult ties to the chivalric order, which was a significant thing in itself. Thinking it all through, he realized that in just one single day, he had accomplished not 2 things, but 3, or perhaps even 4. There was also the matter of the Scarlet Mantises he had defeated earlier. Thinking back on it more carefully, he realized they were not particularly fearsome monsters. Given how much stronger he had already become, it would have actually been strange if he had lost. If anything, it had been a perfect situation because it also gave him the chance to learn the castle archery technique he had been wanting for so long. Second could barely contain his excitement as he thought about everything that lay ahead. He was already making plans, helping Sylvia develop the skills she actually needed, diving into dungeons to gain experience, hunting for rare drops along the way. Another wave of laughter bubbled up out of him. Out in the hallway, the receptionist heard him laughing again and had absolutely no idea what to make of it. Sylvia looked puzzled when she heard the term magic archery for the first time. Second explained that he believed it was the right fit for her. A magic archer who specialized in combining sorcery and archery. He pointed to her stats as the reason. Her DX was at 121, her INT was at 103, and everything else was in the double digits. Because she was clearly a DX type with an unusually high INT as well. The magic archer path made the most sense for her. Sylvia said she had never even heard of magic archery before. That gave Second pause. He wondered to himself whether magic archers simply did not exist in that world, since he was fairly certain it had been a relatively common job class back in a game called Manga. That was not a good sign. He turned back to Sylvia and asked whether she knew of any skills that combined sorcery and archery in some way. She said no. Second let it go and told her that regardless, something like that did exist, and that was what she would be working toward. Sylvia was still confused, but went along with it. Second laid out the plan. First, she would go to the library and learn the fundamental skills needed for archery. After that, they would head to the forest where she would join him in acquiring the skills needed for swordsmanship. Sylvia looked completely lost by the combination of the two. Second thought to himself that it felt strangely like he was walking a complete beginner through the basics of Manga. He told her simply to just follow his lead. Sylvia kept her eyes on him, and when he noticed her looking, she gave him a warm smile. Second was caught slightly off guard by it. He agreed, and they moved on. Later, out in the forest, Sylvia was completely stunned. She demanded to know how he could possibly know the things he knew. Second calmly asked why she was so upset. Sylvia insisted she was not upset. She was utterly dumbfounded. The methods he had shared with her, things like bishop archery and castle archery, and how to acquire them, were among the most closely guarded secrets in existence. That kind of knowledge was passed down exclusively within noble families and was never to be shared with anyone outside of them. Hearing that, Second finally understood why the overall level of skill in that world was so low. He muttered quietly to himself that nobles clearly enjoyed holding onto their privileges. Sylvia warned him that if nobles ever found out he had shared something like this, he would be tortured to death. Second simply asked her to keep the information to herself. Sylvia shot back that if she actually used such advanced archery techniques, she would be exposed immediately. Second calmly suggested that she simply not use them in public. Sylvia stopped, realizing that was actually a reasonable solution. though she trailed off without finishing her thought. After that, Second brought Sylvia along on a journey that involved her constantly pestering him with questions at every turn. Despite that, he successfully guided her through acquiring Knight Archery, Silver General Archery, Gold General Archery, and Bishop Archery one by one. Just as Second had managed to learn them, Sylvia was also able to pick all of them up without much difficulty. Later, inside a cave, Sylvia wiped the sweat from her forehead and admitted that it already felt like she had experienced enough surprises to last a lifetime just in that one day. Second remarked casually that it was still far too early to feel that way, which made Sylvia flinch. He then asked her to think about how he had used the methods he had taught her to raise his EXP so effectively. Before she could answer, hundreds of bottles of high potions suddenly materialized and were transferred over to her. She stared at the enormous pile of expensive potions in complete shock and immediately jumped to the conclusion that he was telling her to consume all of them herself. Second quickly corrected her. That was not what he had said at all. They were going to use the potions to carry out something called the DK tactic. Sylvia had never heard of it and echoed the term back in confusion. Second thought privately to himself that what was about to come out of her mouth would almost certainly be the loudest reaction of the entire day. Sure enough, the moment he explained it, Sylvia's scream echoed all the way through the cave. Later, they returned to town and sat down to eat. Second asked Sylvia whether she wanted to learn castle archery as well. She hesitated, saying she would like to if it was possible, but before she could finish the thought, Second had already decided for both of them. They would be heading to a dungeon that very day. Sylvia repeated the word dungeon in shock. Second thought through his plan quietly. The dungeon they would be going to was a second-ranked, one called Royce. Dungeons in that world were divided into 3 ranks. First rank was for experts, second rank was for intermediate adventurers, and third rank was for beginners. There were 2 reasons for going straight to an intermediate dungeon. The first was a reward for clearing it. The boss of Royce Dungeon was a large wolf-like monster called a flame wolf, and it dropped a rare weapon known as the flame wolf bow, a superior longbow infused with fire elemental effects that Second was determined to obtain no matter what. The second and more important reason was Sylvia's acquisition of castle archery, which he considered the primary goal of the trip. The monsters needed to fulfill the acquisition requirements for that skill appeared inside that particular dungeon. In short, their mission was to search for rare drops while simultaneously working toward fulfilling the skill acquisition conditions at the same time. Inside the dungeon, Sylvia moved carefully, staying alert and scanning her surroundings. Then Second announced that he had found what they were looking for. Sylvia drew a sharp breath. He pointed out the monsters they had come specifically to find and instructed Sylvia to do her best to defeat them using the Silver General Archery technique. If she was not yet comfortable with it, she could also practice mixing it together with Knight Archery in combination. Sylvia agreed without hesitation. She reached out and gripped the string of her longbow, drew it back, aimed carefully at the monster, and released. The monster was defeated instantly. Sylvia stood completely frozen in place. She asked Second in a trembling voice whether she had somehow become incredibly powerful all of a sudden. Second noted internally that thanks to the DK tactic, Sylvia's EXP had skyrocketed, and both her Knight Archery and Silver General Archery had already reached the first grade. He gave her a confident smile and reminded her that he had promised this would happen. Sylvia's eyes went wide, and then her face broke into a bright, genuine smile as she thanked him. Second could not help but notice privately that Sylvia looked genuinely beautiful when she smiled like that, though he reminded himself that she was usually quite different in her normal demeanor. After that moment, Sylvia became uncontrollably excited and threw herself fully into the fight, serving as backup with remarkable effectiveness. She seemed to have found a sudden and powerful sense of purpose, declaring out loud that she was going to become a magic archer. Just then, Second noticed something ahead and immediately told Sylvia to stop. He noted internally that it had been close to 6 hours since they had entered the dungeon. They were now down to the very last requirement needed for Sylvia to acquire castle archery. That final requirement was to kill 3 monsters in a row, monsters that had attacked and drained at least 50% of another player's HP, with a single shot each from at least 5 meters away, using a combination of Knight Archery and Silver General Archery. The reason he had called for a stop was because their target monster had just appeared ahead of them. The ground shook with every step the massive creature took. Second thought to himself that the flaming troll was a large monster with exceptional attack power, but its smooth, shiny cranium was an obvious weak spot. A single headshot using Sylvia's first-grade Silver General Archery should be enough to bring one down. He counted 3 flaming trolls in front of them, which was exactly what they needed. He glanced over at Sylvia and instructed her to use a combination of Knight and Silver General Archery to aim at the trolls' craniums from at least 5 meters away and to wait for his signal before firing. Sylvia agreed, but asked what he planned to do. Second gave her a vague answer, saying only that he was going to face the unavoidable. He added firmly that no matter what happened, she was not to lose her composure. Sylvia nodded immediately. Second checked his stats. His HP was full. In terms of numbers, his VIT should technically be sufficient to withstand 3 critical hits from the flaming trolls. A nervous sweat ran down his face as he tried to convince himself that would be fine. But deep down, he knew it was absolutely not fine. It was genuinely terrifying. However, this step was completely necessary to fulfill the rear guard condition for castle archery. He had to steel himself and go through with it. Before he had fully steadied himself, a powerful strike connected directly with his face and sent him flying through the air. Sylvia cried out his name in alarm. Second hit the ground hard and lay there for a moment in disbelief. That kind of blow was something he had never experienced before. He coughed up blood. He quickly checked his stats again and was somewhat surprised to find that even after taking that hit, his HP had only dropped by about a quarter. He winced and wondered to himself whether his back teeth would recover from that. He thought briefly about how in Mabayon, even losing an entire limb could be fixed with a high-grade potion, but he reminded himself there was no guarantee the same rules applied in this world. He questioned whether this plan had been a mistake. He pushed himself back to his feet and refused to accept that it was over. Sylvia was still waiting for his signal. The massive troll loomed over him. Second froze for a moment in genuine horror, but clamped his mouth shut and forced himself to stay where he was. He reminded himself of who he was. He was number one, the world's number one, and someone like that would never show a shameful side of himself. He whispered to himself, barely audibly, that he was going to claim that same title in this world too, even as an alternate character. The top position was his. It was his life, his very reason for existing. He was not going to surrender it to anyone. He repeated those words over and over in his mind until the fear began to loosen its grip, and then he stood his ground and faced the troll. He braced himself. The troll swung its weapon and slammed him hard into the wall and then down to the ground. Second lay there for a split second, wondering about the state of his HP. He checked his stats quickly and saw it had dropped to just under 50%. That was the signal. He immediately gave Sylvia the cue to fire. Sylvia, who had been standing at a distance in a state of readiness the entire time, drew back her bow with precision, aimed at the troll's cranium, and released. The arrow struck true, and the troll was defeated instantly. Second smirked to himself, and thought that there were just 2 more left to go. But the moment it was all over, Sylvia came rushing toward him, shouting at him through tears that he was a fool, an absolute, reckless fool. Even as she continued to scold him with tears streaming down her face, Second could not stop smirking. They made their way out of the dungeon. Sylvia was beside herself when she realized she had actually acquired castle archery at last. She kept asking aloud in disbelief whether it was truly real, turning to Second repeatedly in amazement, unable to fully process what had just happened. Watching her celebrate like that, Second smiled to himself and felt a deep and strangely unfamiliar sense of satisfaction settle over him. From the very bottom of his heart, he was glad he had endured what he had gone through. He thought to himself that his life as an alternate character in this different world was going to be full of excitement now that he had found a comrade like Sylvia. Having recovered from whatever had set them back, Second and Sylvia regrouped and pushed forward through the Royce dungeon. The only thing standing between them and completing it was the boss. Second warned Sylvia that beyond the next door was the territory of the Flame Wolves. The Flame Wolf was the dungeon's boss, a massive wolf-shaped monster wreathed entirely in fire. Its flame barrier made it highly resistant to damage, and by general consensus among the people of Mabayon, it was considered one of the more frustrating enemies anyone could encounter. However, Second had a specific plan in mind, and it involved a technique known as stun locking. Sylvia did not immediately understand what he meant by that. Second recalled to himself that he had once found a way to reduce flame wolves to something barely worth fighting, and the key to it had been stun locking. He laid out the strategy for Sylvia in detail. He would open with a bishop archery attack, and the flame wolf, drawn to him, would charge in his direction. He would stop it using gold general. Then Sylvia would take her turn and fire at it using bishop archery, and when it turned and charged toward her, she would repel it the same way using gold general. Then Second would fire again with bishop archery, and the cycle would repeat itself indefinitely. In his mind, he had a name for this, the ultimate gold bishop stun, a well-known technique that required 2 or more people to execute properly. Sylvia was uncertain, questioning whether something so straightforward could really work. Second told her plainly that whether it worked was beside the point. It was simply the safest available method. They went in and executed the strategy. They defeated the Flame Wolf, and then they died. 3 weeks passed. Over the course of those 3 weeks, Sylvia successfully acquired the castle archery skill. The last remaining goal was obtaining a drop item called the Flame Wolf's Bow. They returned to the Royce dungeon every day and hunted flame wolves repeatedly, and after killing well over 100 of them, the bow finally dropped. Sylvia was thrilled, immediately assuming the bow was meant for Second and declaring that it would make him even more powerful than before. Second corrected her without hesitation. The bow was not for him, it was for her. Sylvia was stunned. He explained that since she was on the path to becoming a magic archer, it made complete sense for her to be the one using it. As for himself, he was planning to move towards sorcery from that point forward, which meant he had no particular use for the bow. He told her to make good use of it. Sylvia asked again whether he was truly sure, and then thanked him. She glanced back at him a moment later, having caught something in what he had just said, asking him to repeat himself. He told her flatly that he had called her Sylvia the Motormouth Numbskull, and then clarified that the relevant part of what he had said was about his shift to sorcery. Sylvia admitted that he had never mentioned that to her before. Second acknowledged this and apologized for not telling her sooner. Sylvia was quiet for a brief moment, mildly sulky, before her expression shifted into something more thoughtful, and then into a smile. She reflected aloud on the path he had taken. Archery first, then swordsmanship, and now sorcery. She said it no longer seemed impossible that he might one day become the best in the world. Second acknowledged he still had a long way to go, but then moved the conversation to a more pressing matter he needed to discuss with her. He asked whether she had any connections to a Royal Academy of Magic. Sylvia repeated the question back to him with some confusion. He confirmed it, asking whether, as the second daughter of the Virginia family's Knight Order, she might have some kind of access or relationship there that could be useful. He explained his reasoning to himself internally. Learning sorcery required reading grimoires. The grimoires for the Opio form were available in regular libraries, but the Raptor and Coeurl forms were a different matter entirely, found only within academies of magic. Getting access to one was essential. The Royal Academy of Magic was restricted to teachers and enrolled students, and while he could theoretically go through the formal enrollment process, he had no way of knowing how long that would take. He wanted to find a faster route, to use whatever connections might exist to request temporary access to explore the academy, just long enough to find what he needed. Sylvia's answer was immediate and definitive. She explained that her father had essentially written her off after she demonstrated no talent with the sword, and she could not imagine him entertaining any kind of request from a daughter he considered worthless. Second suggested she demonstrate her current abilities to him as a way of changing his perception of her. Sylvia dismissed this as well, explaining that her father was the kind of man who would not soften regardless of what she showed him. He had earned his knighthood through his own swordsmanship in battle, and in his eyes Sylvia had abandoned the sword and run away to archery instead. Any display of skill with a bow would likely only confirm that view rather than challenge it. Second listened to all of this and came to a conclusion. A straightforward approach through Sylvia's father was clearly not going to work. That left only one viable path: deception. He told her he had a good idea. Sylvia looked at him immediately with deep suspicion, saying she had a powerfully bad feeling about whatever he was about to say. Second smirked and announced that they would be implementing what he was calling the deception tactic, and that it would be put into action the very next day. Sylvia broke into a cold sweat and said her heart was absolutely not prepared for this. The following day, Sylvia's father greeted his visitor with a formal bow, showing the full respect of a knight welcoming someone of apparent importance. Second was filled with disbelief as he tried to make sense of how things had gotten to where they were. His original plan had been straightforward enough: put on some rare-looking clothes, act like a foreign aristocrat, and deceive Sylvia's father into writing them referral letters to the Academy of Magic. That was all it was supposed to be, and yet somehow it appeared that he had deceived Sylvia's father, a man named Noir, far more thoroughly than he had ever intended. Noir seemed to be under the impression that Second was actual foreign royalty. Second could not quite piece together what chain of misunderstandings had led to that conclusion. In the end, he felt a pull toward telling Noir the truth, though for a number of reasons he could not fully sort out his own thoughts on the matter anymore. He told Noir to raise his head. At the same time, he reminded himself privately that there was no turning back now. He had come this far, and the only path forward was to keep playing the role as convincingly as he could. He explained to Noir that due to certain circumstances, he had been concealing his true identity, and left it at that, trusting that Noir understood. Noir confirmed quietly that he did and would not breathe a word of it to anyone. Second allowed himself a small inward smirk. He had taken a blind chance, but it was looking like it would pay off. He told Noir he had come with 2 requests. Noir responded with respectful readiness, saying he would do whatever was asked of him. Second reminded himself to stay focused, no matter how bewildering Noir's manner was. He started with what he called the smaller of the 2 requests. He wanted to be connected with the Royal Academy of Magic, and asked if Noir could arrange something. Noir immediately offered to write him a referral letter right then and there for enrollment as a first-year transfer student. Second thought privately that a full transfer would not work for him. It would take far too long, and what he needed was to get in briefly and make his way through their collection of grimoires. He told Noir he would prefer something shorter. Noir suggested the form of a short-term exchange student. Second agreed and thought it over carefully. He needed enough time to locate the grimoires, which meant 2 or 3 days might be cutting it too close if things did not go smoothly. After weighing it, he settled on 2 weeks and asked Noir to write the referral letter with those terms. Noir said he would see to it. Second moved on to the second and more important request. He told Noir he would get straight to the point. He had taken a liking to Sylvia, having recognized that she possessed a genuine talent for both archery and sorcery. He asked Noir for permission to have her travel by his side. He noticed Noir staring at him with an intense and searching look and worried inwardly about the way he had phrased himself, particularly his choice to refer to himself in the third person as a lord. He was not sure it had come across well, but Noir's reaction surprised him. Noir quickly told Second to raise his head and said that although Sylvia was an undisciplined daughter, if His Highness found her suitable, he was free to make use of her however he wished. Second blinked internally at being called His Highness, but pressed on. Noir asked, However, whether Second was truly certain about Sylvia. Second acknowledged that her skill with the sword was lacking, but insisted that her talent for archery and sorcery could be considered world-class. He assured Noir that Sylvia should leave the chivalric order to accompany him, and mentioned that he had already arranged a 2-year contract borrowing her from the Third Chivalric Order. Once that period ended, he intended to make a further request regarding her, and at that time he hoped to have Noir's support. Noir responded with full agreement and quiet emotion, saying that all he wished for was a path of flourishing service for Sylvia. He said he would wait patiently at home for the praises that were sure to come back to him, even from where he sat. Sylvia's face had gone completely red throughout the exchange. Second stole a quick glance at her and admitted to himself that he was not entirely sure what Noir had been trying to say in his roundabout way, but he took it as a yes. He finished the meeting by remarking that Noir's spirit was admirable and that he, as a lord, would never forget the Virginia family. Once they were outside, Sylvia immediately let out all of her frustration at him, calling him a dummy, a big, unbelievable dummy, and declaring that no matter how many hearts she had, none of them would be able to survive dealing with someone like him. Meanwhile, Second quietly acknowledged to himself that although they had successfully secured access to the Royal Academy of Magic, things had taken a turn far more dramatic than he had bargained for, and it was honestly a little frightening. Deceiving people was not something one ought to do. He reflected on that, at least a little. A week passed after what he privately called the reception tactic. In that time, Second and Sylvia had been selling flame wolf pelts, earning experience points, and living what was by most measures a fairly comfortable and productive life. The bulk of their experience came from hunting slime-type monsters. Deep within the slime forest that lay along the road from the royal capital to the mines, there was a spot where rare slimes with exceptionally rich experience points appeared with some regularity. The greatest reward they had managed to obtain from that area was a drop from a creature called the Holy Slime, an item known as the Recovery Sorcery Wand Med. It was an extraordinarily rare item with a drop rate of only 0.05%. The Recovery Sorcery Wand Med was exceptionally useful. As long as it was equipped, anyone could use the Recovery Med ability from Recovery Sorcery with ease. However, it was particularly valuable for characters whose growth type was set to the healer type, because when healers equipped it, the item gained what was called a plus-plus effect. The plus-plus designation was a second-tier boost, and with it active, the wand's effectiveness became 2.5 times stronger than it would be under normal circumstances. In practical terms, when a healer used Recovery Med with that boost applied, at least half of an intermediate-level character's HP could be expected to recover instantly. Things like broken back teeth, it turned out, only required a small and trivial amount of the recovery ability to fix. Second told Sylvia that it was time for them to head to the Academy of Magic. As he thought it over, he noted that if anyone considered how much he would be saving on high-class potions that cost 800,000 CL each, they would begin to understand just how powerful that additional wand effect truly was. Since neither he nor Sylvia had the healer growth type, they could not gain the plus-plus effect, but simply being able to use Recovery Med without any conditions attached was already a significant advantage on its own. He thought warmly about the holy slime that had dropped it. It had been a truly magnificent gift. Even that little creature was out there somewhere, happily going about its business behind the blades of grass. And now, they had finally arrived at the Royal Academy of Magic. After earning various items and experience points over the past week, the two of them had bided their time until the moment came, and at last they rode up to the academy and dismounted from their horses. A woman was there to greet them, telling them that their arrival had been expected. Second thanked the two professors who had come out to receive them personally. One of the professors, a man, asked if it would be all right to call him by a casual name. Second said that was fine and introduced himself simply as Second, adding that the girl beside him was Sylvia and that they would be in the professor's care for the next 2 weeks. The woman then stepped forward and introduced herself as the headmaster, Paula Memento, expressing her hope that they would all get along well. The man followed and introduced himself as Kevin, the homeroom teacher of first-year Class A, which was the class Second had been placed in, and said he hoped they would get along. Second took the opportunity to ask, right away, whether Sylvia would be placed in the same Class A as him. Headmaster Paula confirmed that she would, and also explained that during his exchange stay, he would be lodging in a separate house rather than the school dormitory, so their rooms would not be far apart. She then suggested they get moving, mentioning that uniforms had also been prepared for them. As he followed along behind them, Second noted quietly to himself that things seemed to be going smoothly so far. No one appeared to suspect anything in particular, which was reassuring, but he knew he would need to stay sharp and focused for the full 2 weeks ahead. Professor Kevin walked alongside them and mentioned that the plan for that day was to hold a lesson in the morning and then give them a tour of the school in the afternoon, asking if that arrangement worked for them. Second asked whether Kevin himself would be the one giving the tour. Kevin explained that it would not be him. He had already recruited one of the students from Class A few days prior to serve as their guide, and it had all been arranged. He added that afternoons were generally set aside for self-study, but the more advanced students had free time during those periods. Second said he was grateful for the arrangement. In the back of his mind, he was already planning to use the afternoon tour as an opportunity to quietly extract information from his guide, specifically about the location of the grimoires he was searching for. Professor Kevin then announced that they had arrived and gestured to the door of Class A. He entered the room first and greeted everyone inside. He announced to the class that as he had already informed them, 2 exchange students would be joining Class A for a period of 2 weeks starting that day, and invited the 2 of them to come in. The moment they stepped through the door, every pair of eyes in the room turned toward them. Second stepped forward first and introduced himself, giving his name and explaining that he had come from an island country called Zipong to spend some time at the academy, and expressed his hope that they would all get along well. The moment he finished and offered a smile, a visible ripple of excitement ran through the girls in the classroom. Several of them could not hold back their reactions, whispering and exclaiming among themselves about how handsome he was, with some going as far as calling him terrific and seriously good-looking. Sylvia then stepped forward and introduced herself shyly as Sylvia Virginia, adding that she hoped everyone could get along. After thanking them both, Kevin directed them to their seats. While the girls in the room continued stealing glances at Second, the boys in the class were equally struck by Sylvia's appearance, whispering quietly among themselves about how remarkably pretty she was. Kevin called the class to attention and announced that since it was a special occasion with new faces joining them, they would take the opportunity to review the basics once more. Meanwhile, Second sat at his desk and quietly wondered to himself whether 2 weeks would truly be enough time for him to learn the sorceries he had come there specifically to find. Second was beginning to feel a little worried. Once the lesson was over, he was determined to get someone to show him around as quickly as possible. The moment class ended, he went straight to Professor Kevin and brought up the matter without hesitation, saying it might be a bit sudden, but he wanted to meet the person who would be showing him around that afternoon. He was thinking of grabbing something to eat as well and using the time to get better acquainted with his guide. Kevin smiled and said that was perfectly fine, then called out to a boy named Maine. The boy stepped forward and asked if the professor had called for him. Kevin asked Maine if he was ready for the afternoon tour and explained that the schedule had been moved up a little, requesting that he also show Second the cafeteria. Maine agreed without any issue. Second then asked, before they headed off, whether it would be all right for him to ask Maine questions about sorcery during their time together. He noted privately that he wanted to feel things out first before trying to pull information from Maine, since he did not want to put himself at a disadvantage by being too forward. Kevin told him that was no problem at all, adding that Maine was in fact the class representative of the first years. Second replied that he understood, calling his own question foolish in hindsight. A grin quietly spread across his face. If Maine was the class representative, that meant he could extract as much information from him as he needed without raising any eyebrows. He turned to Maine and suggested they get along well during the tour. Maine smiled back warmly and agreed. Second noted to himself that Maine was not being guarded toward him at all, which was good. He planned to use that openness to find out where the grimoires were kept. But before heading off, he went over to Sylvia, who had found herself surrounded by their curious classmates, and let her know they were heading to the cafeteria. Sylvia answered and quickly apologized to the classmates around her, asking them to let her through. She hurried over and apologized to Second for making him wait. But the moment her eyes landed on the person standing beside him, she froze completely. She stumbled over her words as she addressed Maine, clearly recognizing him as someone of high rank. Second's eyes went wide as the title she used sank in. Maine, however, responded calmly, explaining that inside the school there was no difference in status and asking to be treated as an equal if possible. Sylvia nervously corrected herself and addressed him more carefully, visibly flustered. Second reflected on what had just happened. Maine was a prince. This was his first time actually meeting one in that world. He had half expected a prince to demand people kneel before him, but instead, Maine had simply asked to be treated normally. Second figured he might as well do exactly that. Without any warning, Maine reached out and took Second's hand and suggested they head to the cafeteria together. Second stared down at their joined hands, genuinely puzzled. He could not help but notice how coolly Maine had treated Sylvia, a clearly beautiful girl, while being so forward and assertive with him. Something about the whole situation did not sit right. A troubling thought began to form in his mind about what kind of person Maine might be, and it started to bother him quite a lot. He added it to his mental list of things he needed to address directly. He had never imagined that a day would come where he found himself being pursued by an actual prince. He began to think frantically about how to handle the situation and came to the conclusion that the only way forward was to ask Maine plainly. He stopped walking mid-step and turned to Maine, asking him directly and bluntly whether he was attracted to men. Maine stopped immediately and spun around to face him with a look of complete shock, loudly denying it and demanding to know where that had come from. Sylvia stood nearby with her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Second tried to explain himself, saying that the way Maine had been acting toward him rather than toward Sylvia had given him that impression, though he trailed off uncertainly as he tried to find the right words for it. Maine was completely taken aback and insisted that Second had misread the situation entirely, making it clear that he was completely straight. Second accepted the answer with a calm and simple response. Just at that moment, something small bumped into him from the side. He looked down but did not see anyone there. He glanced around, wondering if he had actually bumped into someone or if it had been his imagination. Nearby, a small girl was continuing on her way down the hall, quietly remarking to herself that the man she had just passed was incredibly handsome. Maine looked at Second with sparkling eyes and told him plainly that he was fond of him. Sylvia stared at Second and asked what was with the proud attitude he was carrying. Second replied simply that she was speaking to the #1 man in the world. Sylvia's jaw dropped open completely. Maine jumped in and said that was exactly the kind of thing he meant. Second was the first truly honest person he had ever spoken to. He went on to explain that he had been genuinely excited when he heard that status differences did not matter inside the Royal Academy of Magic, but in the end, everyone still saw him as nothing more than the second prince. Whether he was at the Royal Palace or at the Academy, that was all he ever was to people. It truly seemed like only his mother ever saw him as a real person rather than a title. Second commented that it was a pretty ordinary kind of story. Sylvia immediately smacked him on the chest and scolded him for being rude. But Maine quickly stepped in and told her it was all right, pointing out that this was a man who, the very moment he had figured out Maine was a prince, had turned around and bluntly asked him whether he was attracted to men. After something like that, a little impoliteness hardly registered anymore. Second shrugged it off and moved straight to the question he actually wanted answered, asking Maine whether he knew where the grimoires were kept. Maine explained that within the academy, there were grimoires for the Opo and Raptor forms in the library. The Coeurl form was also in the library, though borrowing it required permission from the head librarian. As for the fourth form, Second interrupted before Maine could finish, asking with surprise whether they actually had the fourth form there as well. Maine clarified that they did not. He believed the fourth form was being kept at the Royal Palace, as he had seen it there once before. Second said he understood. Maine then suggested it was about time they headed off and proceeded to guide them through the academy. He was so thoroughly and carefully courteous as a guide that by the time they finally reached their main destination, the library, the sun had already completely set. Maine informed them that they had arrived at the library, though he noted it was already closed for the evening. He reminded them that any student of the Royal Academy was free to use it and encouraged them to come back first thing the next morning. He then waved goodbye cheerfully, saying the afternoon had been a great deal of fun and that he would see them both the following day before heading off. Once he was gone, Second let out a long and heavy sigh. His shoulders felt stiff with tension. Sylvia remarked that she felt the same way. Second gave her a brief look and then told her that starting the next day, she was going to be spending her time in the library. She was going to learn fire magic. He noted internally that mastering sorcery was a necessary step toward acquiring magic archery. At the very least, he wanted her to learn the Raptor form and the Coeurl form of fire magic, so that she could use them together with the Flame Wolf Bow, which was already imbued with fire. Just then, a loud and careless laugh echoed from behind them. Two men were talking to each other nearby, one remarking to the other about the exchange students they'd seen that day, saying the pair of them looked intimidating, both the boy and the girl. The other man agreed enthusiastically. The first added that he had seen them together with Prince Maine and suggested something must be going on there. The other one asked whether he meant that bookworm with what he called an Oedipus complex. The first tried to warn him to be careful about saying something like that, but the other brushed it off, insisting no one was listening and pressing his friend to admit he privately thought the same thing. The man continued, saying the prince genuinely irritated him, the condescending manner he had, and the way he always said things like telling people not to worry about his status, as if that made him sound humble when it really just came across as sarcastic. That, he said, was probably why the prince always ended up alone. The other burst out laughing and agreed that the prince was completely isolated and that it served him right. The first laughed along with him. Nearby, both Sylvia and Second had pressed themselves against the wall and were listening to every word being said. Second felt uneasy as the conversation went on. He thought to himself that the gossip had taken a deeply unpleasant turn, and that Maine had apparently been alone all along. He also recognized that what was being described sounded a lot like indirect bullying. He came to a quiet and somewhat reluctant conclusion. He was going to have to become Maine's friend, not purely out of kindness, he admitted to himself, but also because building a connection with the Castall royal family might give him a way to access the fourth form grimoire that was being kept at the palace. He told himself he really had no choice in the matter whatsoever. The two men kept talking. One brought up how the prince apparently spent a great deal of money to have his grades altered, and despite that he still acted as though he were above everyone else, all while people were genuinely working hard. The other agreed that the prince was becoming quite detestable, pretending on the outside to be a model student while doing things like that behind the scenes. The first added that the prince making friends with so-called exchange students like them only confirmed it. Trash, he said, had a way of gathering together, though he added a casual note that he was only joking. The other laughed and said that if they were going that far, they should include the so-called beast loser in that group as well. The first agreed, saying he had nearly forgotten about that failure too, and burst into laughter. But then he glanced at the side and stopped cold. Sylvia was standing right in front of them. Second was equally caught off guard, realizing she had stepped out from behind the wall and was now facing the two men directly. One of the men gasped in shock when he realized it was the exchange student standing before him. Sylvia glared at him with open anger and demanded to know whether what they had been saying counted as bestial discrimination. The man stood there in stunned silence, unable to respond. Sylvia repeated the question, her eyes still fixed on him. The other man quickly jumped in to deny it, explaining that she probably was not aware, but there was a student in Class F called Eco Leaflet who was known as a failure. The first man backed him up, insisting that the person in question was genuinely incompetent and happened to be a beast folk by coincidence, so they were not targeting anyone based on race. Sylvia fired back, asking them calmly but pointedly to explain why they had referred to both her and second as trash. The men immediately broke into a cold sweat. One of them nervously began to say that she would understand if they explained themselves properly. But before he could get any further, Sylvia raised her fist and slammed it into both of their heads without any warning, declaring loudly that it was too late for explanations. The two men turned and fled immediately. Sylvia watched them go with a satisfied smile, announcing to herself that justice had been properly served. She stood with her chest puffed out in quiet pride. Second told her it was time to head back. As they walked, he could not stop turning over what the men had said earlier in his mind. The name Eco Leaflet, the so-called beast loser, stuck with him. He decided it was worth remembering for the time being. The following afternoon, Second went straight to the library. He approached the librarian and requested to read the grimoires for the raptor form, covering all elements. The librarian smiled and told him that was no trouble at all, asking him to give her just a moment. She returned shortly after and handed over what he had asked for. Second opened the grimoire for the raptor form of fire and read through it. He closed the book, muttered that he had what he needed, and said he would move on to the next one. He passed the book to Sylvia. She looked at him in mild disbelief and asked if he was already finished. He told her he had acquired it. Sylvia murmured to herself that it was just another ordinary day for him. She watched from the side with amazement as he casually and almost lazily flipped through the remaining 3 grimoires one after the other and handed them all over to her in turn. He had learned everything from all of them. Sylvia let out a sigh and wondered to herself whether she could possibly manage to learn any of it within 2 weeks. She asked Second if there were any tricks or pointers he could share with her. Second paused at the question. The words tricks, secrets, and key points were terms he deeply disliked. In his previous life, when he had held the title of the world's #1 player, he had been endlessly pestered by newcomers asking him to share tricks for getting stronger or shortcuts for improving their skills. The memories were unpleasant in the extreme. People with clearly selfish motives approaching the world's #1 simply to find the fastest way to skip ahead without putting in any real effort. And yet now, hearing the same word again in this world, he noticed something unexpected. It did not bother him at all. He thought about why that was. Sylvia was genuinely worried that she would cause him trouble if she could not pick up the skills within the 2 weeks they had. She was swallowing her pride to ask for help. That consideration, that sincerity, was something genuinely pleasing to witness. This was not some shallow online interaction. This was a real and close exchange between 2 people sharing the same world and the same circumstances. It was completely different from what he had experienced in his previous life. Far from feeling annoyed, he found that he was actually glad she was relying on him. Without much warning, Second shifted closer to her and told her that while he had planned for them to work separately that day, he had changed his mind and would teach her himself. Sylvia flushed slightly at the brief contact of their shoulders, filled with a feeling he had never experienced before in his life, a genuine delight in teaching someone. He sat down beside her. Sylvia looked both a little remorseful and quietly happy as he settled in next to her, her face going red at how close they were sitting. Second taught her carefully, and after a good stretch of time had passed, he decided they had done enough for the day. He noted privately that upon taking a serious look at the grimoires for the first time, he found them to be wordy and genuinely difficult to follow. Compared to reading through material like that, a more practical and hands-on approach would be 10,000 times more effective. For Sylvia's benefit, he focused on explaining things that would actually stick, what kind of magical effects each ability had, how to use them properly, how firepower worked, and how it was calculated, how things had changed across different ranks over time, and what the cooldown periods looked like at each level. He walked her through as many clear and memorable points as he could, the kind of detailed knowledge one might find compiled on a dedicated reference page. In the middle of it all, Sylvia asked in slight disbelief whether she was really expected to memorize all of it. Second told her plainly that she was. He thought to himself that this kind of study was the only thing he had ever truly bothered to put his mind to, everything about the game called Manga. He had studied it more thoroughly than anyone else alive, and now that knowledge, which had been entirely useless in his ordinary life, had become more powerful than any weapon he could have carried. He could not feel anything but happiness about that. He asked Sylvia if she had managed to get it all. She shook her head and apologized, saying she needed a little more time with it. Second told her not to worry about it, and suggested they head back. As they made their way out, a girl suddenly exclaimed loudly and came hurrying toward them, declaring enthusiastically that he was incredibly handsome. Second stopped, turned to face her, and asked if she was referring to him. The girl pointed directly at him and confirmed without any hesitation that she was. She introduced herself as Eco Leaflet and asked what his name was. The name landed immediately in Second's thoughts. This was the person who had come up in that overheard conversation the night before. He told her his name. The girl repeated it back with energy and delight. She then leaned slightly to peek around him and asked about the girl beside him. Sylvia introduced herself politely and said she was pleased to meet her. Eco replied happily that she was pleased to meet Sylvia as well, reaching out and shaking her hand with warmth. Second looked at her and could not help thinking privately that such an adorable and seemingly harmless girl was being bullied. The thought was outrageous to him, completely unforgivable. He asked her carefully whether anything was troubling her. Iko paused for a brief moment and then answered that not really, nothing in particular. Second turned the words over in his mind. He told her that if anything troubling ever did come up, she should let him know and he would find a way to help. Iko's face immediately lit up and she thanked him with excitement, asking if he truly meant it. Second then noticed a large pile of things stacked behind her and asked what all those books were about. Iko repeated the question back cheerfully and explained that everyone had asked her to carry them for them. Second realized quietly that she was being used as an errand runner. He asked whether she could manage all of that on her own. Iko said proudly that she was perfectly fine and that she was actually quite strong. Second responded flatly that since he was there anyway, he would help her with it. Iko looked genuinely surprised and asked if he was really sure about that. He confirmed it and added that he was personally going out of his way to assist her, which was a rare thing, and she should consider herself fortunate. Iko studied him for a moment, then smiled and thanked him warmly, but said she would handle it herself. Second asked her why. Iko explained with full sincerity that carrying things for others was about the only thing she was good at, and so she was doing her very best to be as helpful as possible to everyone around her. She genuinely believed that if she became helpful enough, people would eventually treat her kindly in return. The words hit Second like a blow. He stood completely still, his eyes filling with a quiet but burning rage as his fist tightened at his side. He thought to himself that she needed to stop, that what she was doing was not the path she thought it was. Iko waved brightly at them and pushed the heavy cart of books forward with cheerful determination. Second watched her go, and as she disappeared from view, his face darkened considerably. Her honest and desperate efforts, spinning endlessly without ever connecting to anything real, brought something painful rushing back to him. He remembered that feeling from his own life, the pointlessness of it all. He had poured himself into online games more than anyone, had climbed to the position of world's #1, and in the end it had amounted to nothing. It was just a game. All that effort, all that sacrifice, risked for something ultimately meaningless. He had spent time thinking over and over about how pointless and empty his efforts had been, how foolish and worthless he had felt as a person, until eventually he had died in shame and despair. And then he had arrived in this world, which had felt like nothing short of a miracle, a blessing from the gods, as some might say. Someone as completely hopeless as he had been had somehow, inexplicably, been given another chance. But as he thought about Iko, he asked himself painfully whether a miracle like that would really happen for her too. He felt her feelings in a way that went bone deep, because he had lived something very close to them. And that was precisely why, now that he had seen her situation clearly, he wanted more than anything to save her with his own hands, more urgently than he had ever wanted anything. Sylvia's voice broke through his thoughts, calling his name. He snapped back to the present. That night, alone in his room, Second turned the question of Iko over and over in his mind. Was she truly as incompetent as people said? And if she was, how had she managed to enroll in a prestigious institution like the Royal Academy of Magic, which was renowned throughout the kingdom and only accepted students with genuine knowledge and ability in magic? Anyone who made it through the doors of that academy should by definition be capable of using various kinds of magic. Something about the picture people painted of her did not add up. He spent the entire night thinking through every angle, and by morning he had arrived at one single conclusion. He told Sylvia that he believed they should recruit Iko Leaflet. Sylvia's face brightened instantly and completely. She told him that there was nothing more pleasing than finding that her path and his were pointing in the same direction, and said she felt like a truly lucky person. Second cut her off before she could go any further and asked her not to suddenly drop to her knees and take on the role of a devoted knight first thing in the morning. Sylvia acknowledged that they did not even know yet whether Iko would agree to anything. Second told her that if Iko declined, he would at the very least ask to see her status, so he could give her some advice on what path she ought to take. Sylvia nodded and agreed, but they were stopped in their tracks by a commotion just ahead. Iko Leaflet was on the ground, kneeling in the dirt, covered in filth. Both Second and Sylvia stared at the scene with wide eyes. Sylvia rushed over to her immediately, her voice tight with concern, asking what had happened and whether she was all right. Second looked around and took in what he was seeing more broadly. Not a single student passing by was reaching out to help. They walked straight past, eyes averted, pretending not to notice, ignoring her completely. He felt something deeply unpleasant radiating from that indifference, a hostility that did not need words. Second went to Iko and asked gently what was wrong, whether she was all right, and whether she had fallen. Iko violently pushed his hand away and shouted at him not to touch her and not to speak to her. Second went still. He recognized it immediately. This was the very worst of all possible things. The scent he had once known himself, the unmistakable scent of despair. Iko suddenly sprang to her feet and ran, shouting at them to stay away from her. Sylvia and Second chased after her anyway. As he ran, Second turned the situation over in his mind. He did not know the exact details of what had happened to her, but he understood one thing with complete clarity, and Iko had finally been forced to understand it too. Her efforts had been futile all along. Earlier, Iko had been carrying heavy sacks and stacking them up for the people around her. One of the men nearby had snickered and remarked to another that she was going out of her way to bring them the very mud that was about to be thrown at her. The other agreed that she was truly a fool. Iko had paused with a confused expression, and in that moment a lump of mud struck her directly, covering her body in filth. The men burst into laughter. In that instant, Iko had been forced to confront a reality she had been turning away from for a very long time. That no matter how much she kept lying to herself, no matter how hard she tried, nothing was ever going to change. She simply cannot go on. It was too painful to witness. Everyone deserved to have dreams, and watching hers collapse so completely in front of her was heartbreaking. Iko's eyes went cold and hollow as that truth sank in. Second, who had been following close behind the whole time, said quietly to himself that they had to save her. Iko kept running. Sylvia finally managed to catch up to her, but Iko slapped her hands away and refused to be touched. Second kept chasing until they eventually cornered her in a spot where she could not easily run further. Iko faced them with tearful and frightened eyes, crying out for them to leave her alone. Second observed that at least an hour had passed since the chase began. Sylvia was visibly exhausted, but Iko somehow still had energy left to spare. Sylvia tried to speak gently to her, telling her they only wanted to talk and that everything was all right. Iko refused and demanded they go away and leave her in peace. Tears began to pour down her face. Watching her, Second felt a deep certainty settle over him that simply leaving her alone like this would be the most futile thing of all. She was already on the losing side of something much bigger. As he stood there observing her, he recalled how she had been running, not fast, but with stubborn, forceful energy, and how she had pushed Sylvia away with considerable strength. He began to think through what that suggested about her. Iko was slow but powerful. She had a great deal of stamina. She likely had very low sorcery attack power, or INT. He recognized it was a gamble, a significant one, but he decided it was worth taking. Second reached for his sword and warned Sylvia not to be startled by what he was about to do. He stepped closer to Iko. She cried out again for him to stay back. He raised the sword. Sylvia watched him in horror. Iko was stunned and confused, asking him what he was doing. Before she could finish the question, Second brought the sword down and cut off his own arm without hesitation. Sylvia and Iko both froze in absolute shock. Second clenched his teeth and endured the blinding pain from a wound. Sylvia rushed toward him and screamed at him that he was a fool, but Second ordered her to stay back. She had no choice but to stop. With his remaining hand, Second held out the wand toward Iko. In his mind, he reasoned that if he could get Iko to join his party here and now, he would move meaningfully closer to becoming the world's #1. And there was a very specific reason why she was the key to that. He handed the wand to Iko and told her plainly that she was suited for recovery sorcery, and instructed her to take it and heal his arm. In his thoughts, Second had already reached his conclusion. Iko was a paladin. The wand he was holding out to her was the recovery sorcery wand med, the extraordinarily rare item they had obtained from the holy slime. It allowed anyone who equipped it to use the recovery sorcery called recovery med. But if Iko's growth type was indeed paladin, then the ++ bonus effect, the one normally limited to healer growth types, would activate when she used it. And the result would be a recovery powerful enough to regenerate his arm completely and instantaneously. Iko stared at him without words and shook her head, insisting through tears that she could not do it. Second groaned that it hurt and urged her to hurry. Iko hesitated again and shook her head once more. Second raised his voice and told her firmly that there were no excuses, that she could do it, and that she needed to hurry. Faced with no other choice, Iko took the wand with trembling hands and quietly agreed. Second encouraged her in his mind, urging her silently to believe she could help, to understand that this was her way out. Without wasting another moment, with tears still streaming down her face, Iko raised the wand and pointed it at Second's severed arm. The wand lit up with a brilliant glow. Iko cried out the word to heal. In the very next instant, Second's arm grew back completely. He looked down at it and murmured softly that it was back to normal. Iko's knees buckled beneath her as she stared at his arm in stunned disbelief. Then Second's body swayed and crumpled to the ground. He managed a faint apology that he could not hold on any longer before losing consciousness entirely. Sylvia cried out his name and rushed to his side. As his awareness faded, Second's thoughts worked through what he had just confirmed. In that world, even when HP was restored or injuries were healed, the body's physical condition did not bounce back immediately. But more importantly, he had figured out Iko's growth type while chasing after her. She was slow but strong, had enormous stamina, and was struggling badly in a school built entirely around magic. That meant her INT was extremely low. She did not fit the image of a sorceress in any way. She was not fast enough for archery. Her strength was decent, but her agility was too low to make her a mobile fighter. And yet, despite her low INT, she appeared to have a tremendous amount of MP taken together. Those traits seemed to paint a picture of someone completely hopeless. And yet some of the highest ranked players in the game had deliberately chosen that exact growth type. And there was a reason for that. Paladins use their high HP, stamina, and VIT to master shield arts. They stood as an immovable wall between their companions and the enemy, absorbing hit after hit, and the moment they took damage they used recovery sorcery on themselves to bring their own HP back up. In other words, they could hold that wall indefinitely until their MP ran dry. A paladin on a team was not a weakness, they were a cornerstone. Every team that had risen to fame at the highest levels had one. If second could bring a paladin like Iko into his party, the formation would become something truly complete. Iko as the frontline wall, himself as the all-rounder in the middle, and Sylvia as the magic archer in the rear, advance, middle, and rear guard perfectly balanced. With a team like that, he would close in dramatically on becoming the world's #1. And from there, he could aim even higher. He wanted Iko on his team. That was the one thought that rang clear and certain in his fading mind above everything else. Second was fully aware of what he was doing. He was trying to make use of Iko, trying to bring her to his side because he was certain she would be genuinely valuable once she learned recovery sorcery properly. Thinking about it, he realized he had done the same thing with Sylvia before. He had taken advantage of the emptiness in her heart and pushed her somewhat forcefully toward joining him. He had gone to considerable lengths to earn her sympathy and pull her in his direction. And yet the truth underneath all of it was simple. He genuinely wanted her to follow him. In the quiet of his fading consciousness, he found himself making a soft and sincere plea for her to do just that. Slowly, he came back to awareness and found himself lying inside a room. Sylvia rushed to his side the moment she saw his eyes open, calling out in breathless relief that he was awake. She grabbed his hand and told him firmly not to go overboard like that again, reminding him that without that hand he would never be able to become the world's #1. Second looked at her gently and pointed out with some difficulty that it was actually his left hand she was holding, not the one that mattered. Sylvia's face instantly went red with embarrassment. She let go quickly and let out a long sigh. She then told him he had quite the nightmare while he was out. Second stayed quiet for a moment before giving a small, easy smile and telling her it was nothing to worry about. Sylvia repeated his words back at him with feeling. She told him that worrying about him should have been her line, not his. She reminded him that both she and Iko had been saved by him, not by anyone else. He had pulled her out of a completely hopeless situation as though it were nothing. Because of that, she said there was no reason for him to carry any worry on his own. She told him she would become his knight and follow him wherever he went, no matter the distance. She gave him a soft smile before quietly leaving the room. Second sat up on the bed and wondered whether she had heard him talking in his sleep. But then he reconsidered. It was not just that. He was fairly certain that Sylvia had seen through him from the very beginning. His attempts to take advantage of her weakness, his use of her for his own goals, and the unease that sometimes gnawed at him because of it. And despite all of that, she had chosen on her own to say she would follow him. He thought quietly to himself that she was a genuinely good person. Just then, the door flew open with a bang, startling him. Someone burst into the room, calling his name. He turned toward the door and found Iko standing there. She ran straight to him and threw her arms around him in a tight hug, apologizing over and over without stopping. Second gently patted her on the head. He told her again, clearly and directly, that recovery sorcery suited her, and that she should leave school and come with him instead. He thought to himself that this was the ideal moment to ask, and that while he was making use of her vulnerability, he had genuine faith that it would be her salvation rather than her ruin. Iko looked up at him with bright eyes and asked if she could really be helpful to him. Second smiled and confirmed it, telling her they should travel together. But just as quickly, the brightness in Iko's expression faltered and she hesitated. Second noticed the shift and asked quietly whether there was some reason she could not simply leave school. Iko looked at him in surprise and asked how he could have known there was something holding her back. Second simply grinned and reminded her that he was the world's #1. He encouraged her to go ahead and tell him everything. Iko's fist tightened as she gathered herself and began to speak. She told him everything about herself and where she had come from. She had been born in a beastfolk village far from the royal capital. Even as a small child, she had possessed a strangely and extraordinarily high amount of MP, and her father had gone around boasting about it to everyone. The villagers began to believe that such a vast pool of MP must mean she had a remarkable talent for sorcery. The story spread further and further, and the year before, the entire village had pooled their money together and used it to enroll her in the prestigious Royal Academy of Magic. She had become their countryside prodigy, their hope, the girl who, they believed, would become a great sorceress and use that prestige to help the village grow and prosper. As for how she had passed the entrance exam, her growth type meant that only her INT was abnormally low. In every other aspect of sorcery, she had no trouble learning at all. She was in fact superior when it came to acquiring knowledge and skills. She had already learned the raptor form and the wind and earth elements on her own. But because her INT was so devastatingly low, the actual power behind her magic was less than half of what the other students could produce. And because of that gap, she had been labeled a failure. She added quietly that this was why she could not leave. She could not betray the expectations that the entire village had placed on her shoulders and poured their savings into. After finishing her story, Iko could not help but think about what those expectations had actually brought her. They had not lifted her. They had become an enormous and crushing weight that pressed down on the heart of one lone girl, bearing down on her even now. Second told her gently that it was going to be all right. He told her he had already prepared an escape route for her. Iko looked at him with confusion. He told her plainly that she could escape, that she had a good way out right there in front of her. He whispered to himself that this was different from his own situation, when there had been no escape route at all. Iko echoed the words back uncertainly, asking if he truly meant it. He confirmed it and told her again not to worry. He reminded her of what he was working toward, becoming the world's #1. He asked if she understood what that meant. Iko looked at him with an expression that made it clear she had no idea what he was referring to. He explained it to her. It meant the best in the entire world, not a single person stronger than him, and she would be one of the members of his team. He asked her whether there was anything more prestigious than that. The Royal Academy of Magic, he said, was nothing in comparison. Being a court sorceress was trivial. And as for her villagers, they would not just be pleased. They would be absolutely overjoyed. They would hold a festival for 3 days and 3 nights without stopping. They would build a bronze statue of Iko right in the center of the village and pass down stories about her for generations. It would be legendary glory. When she eventually returned home, she would be so revered that everyone who came to meet her would fall to their knees weeping at the sight of her. As he spoke, his tone grew more and more dramatic. He imitated the village chief, making a grand proclamation upon her triumphant return. He imitated her father, probably asking Second for an autograph the moment he laid eyes on him. He performed it all with complete seriousness and a straight face. Iko could not help it. She burst out laughing. And then she laughed again. Tears welled up in her eyes even as she laughed, and the weight that had been sitting so heavily on her for so long seemed, at least for a moment, to lift. Second watched her and smiled quietly to himself. After a short while, Iko called out to him and told him she would go with him. Second smiled at her answer. And just like that, the Paladin Beastfolk Iko leaflet became his ally. Second told Iko that she would be withdrawing from her current studies starting that very day, and instructed her to obtain permission to enroll in Class A as his attendant. Iko agreed immediately without question. The 3 of them then made their way together to the headmaster's office. Headmaster Paula asked if they could give her a little time to sort things out. Second agreed and asked how long they should expect to wait. She told them she would hold an emergency staff meeting at lunch and that a decision would be reached afterward. Second replied that he would look forward to hearing good news and excused them from the office. Once they were outside, Sylvia asked Second why he had done something so bold. Second admitted that he was aware it might have seemed unrealistic, but he had a strong feeling the request would go through regardless. Sylvia asked why he was so confident. He explained his reasoning. They were exchange students, and on top of that, he was presenting himself as a noble from a foreign country whose own eyes had witnessed bullying specifically directed at a beast folk. Sylvia quietly realized what he was getting at. If Zippon was a country known for treating beast folk with respect and dignity, then what had been happening to Iko would be seen as a serious problem. Second finished the thought for her, adding that even if the staff did not see it that way themselves, the whole situation left an extremely poor impression. On top of that, the staff were already in a difficult position, effectively unable to deny that they had been turning a blind eye to the bullying all along. No one wanted further trouble or complications. Everyone would want to resolve the matter as smoothly and quietly as possible, which made it entirely natural that the request would be approved. Iko listened to his reasoning with wide eyes and told him he was remarkably clever. Second replied with a satisfied expression that it was simply because he was the world's #1. After that, the 3 of them headed to the cafeteria. Along the way, Maine spotted them and called out to Second. He mentioned that he had already heard what was happening and asked whether Second was really making Iko his attendant. Second frowned slightly, genuinely puzzled about how Maine already knew. The rumors had apparently spread in less than half a day. He patted Iko on the head and remarked that she was an excellent recovery sorceress, and that the school's failure to recognize that spoke volumes about the nature of the institution. Maine burst into laughter at the bluntness of the comment, and said warmly that Second was exactly as he always was, and that he truly loved that straightforward personality of his. The moment the words truly loved left Maine's mouth, Second gave him a very strange look and started to ask whether Maine really, but before he could finish the sentence, Sylvia smacked him firmly on the back with a clear warning. Iko looked thoroughly confused by the exchange, while Maine simply watched them all with a calm and innocent smile. Just then, Professor Kevin arrived and greeted them, telling them he had been looking for them. Second turned and asked about the decision. Kevin informed them that it had been approved without any objection. Iko would be joining him in Class A starting that day as his attendant. Second said he was glad to hear it. Kevin excused himself and left. Second reflected privately that Kevin had been sharp enough not to ask unnecessary questions, such as why he specifically wanted an attendant or why Class A in particular. If Kevin had pressed for an explanation, Second had been ready to give him a pointed response about making sure Iko would not be bullied again, though he was glad it had not come to that. Sylvia then turned to him with some surprise and asked why he had specifically placed Iko in Class A. Second reminded himself quietly that he had a devoted but somewhat oblivious female knight on his hands. Iko asked the same question, equally curious. Second thought through how to answer it. The simple reply, that it was so Iko would not be bullied again, would have been easy enough to say, but it was not the whole truth. He had briefly considered doing something about the people who had treated Iko so badly, but Iko herself had not wanted that. All she had said was that she wanted to be with him. Both Sylvia and Iko waited for his answer. After a moment of thought, Second simply told them it was because she was his comrade. That was reason enough. After their meal, the three of them went to the library. Second noted internally that their time as exchange students was limited and he needed to help Sylvia learn sorcery as quickly as possible. A week passed. His patient, thorough, and careful instruction appeared to have borne real fruit. Sylvia managed to acquire the fire element raptor form of sorcery in just 3 days. More than that, she seemed to have found her footing and grasped some kind of rhythm for learning. She even remarked one day that she had a strange feeling she might be able to manage the coeurl form as well. Taking that as an opportunity, they ended up borrowing grimoires for all 4 elements of the coeurl form from the librarian. And since they were available, Second decided to acquire all of them himself as well. Sylvia threw herself into the work with visible determination, repeatedly muttering to herself that she was almost there, sitting fixed in her seat as though the library itself had cast a spell over her. By that point, Second had already taught Sylvia everything she needed to know, which left him with a more relaxed stretch of time. He and the others spent some of it lying on the grass and enjoying the calm. Main had found his way over and joined them, and the remaining days settled into a comfortable and easy rhythm. On the surface, it might have looked like Second was simply taking it easy, but he had a clear goal running quietly beneath everything. He was working to get on Main's good side. By that point, he felt he had made significant progress toward it, though he believed he was not quite where he needed to be yet. The reason he wanted to build that closeness with Main came down to one thing: the 4th form grimoires. Main had mentioned that the 4th form was housed inside the royal palace. The grimoires for every element of the 4th form each had roughly a 10% drop rate from the boss of the first ranked dungeon, called Algin, the simplest of all the first ranked dungeons. He was fairly confident that with Sylvia, Iko, and himself working together, clearing Algin dungeon would not be beyond them. But rather than going that route, he had been gradually growing closer to Main in the hope of building the kind of relationship where he could simply ask Main to bring him to the royal palace, and Main would say yes. In the middle of all of this, Iko held up a document she had found and asked what it was. Second turned toward her, and it occurred to him for the first time that Iko had limited reading ability. She had difficulty with the written common language used in that world. Thinking back, he recalled that in the game Mabayon, beastfolk characters other than the important ones had spoken in their own beastfolk language rather than the common tongue. That meant Iko had specifically learned the written language in order to attend the academy, which was no small thing. And despite the enormous handicap of having to read magic grimoires while simultaneously consulting a dictionary, she had somehow managed to acquire the raptor form of wind and earth elements on her own. She could not actually use them given how low her INT was, but the fact that she had learned them at all was remarkable. A thought passed through Second's mind that despite how things might appear on the surface, Iko might actually be a deeply intelligent person. He immediately pushed the thought aside and decided it was probably just his imagination. He told Iko to hand the document over. She passed it to him happily. He read the headline, which announced that entries were now being accepted for the 51st Sorcery Convention. He explained to Iko that it appeared to be a competition held every year, and that the winner would receive a prize. Iko asked what the prize was. Second scanned the poster further, and then went completely still. His eyes had landed on the reward listed for the winner. It was the chase ring. He read it a second time to be sure. His body began to tremble with excitement. He looked over at Iko, his eyes burning with a fierce and focused determination, and declared that they were going to enter the sorcery convention. The chase ring had a rather tacky name, but it was an extraordinarily powerful accessory. Its effect was simple. After casting sorcery, there was a 10% chance of an extra attack triggering, essentially giving the user a double attack. The mechanic itself was straightforward, but the implications of it were massive. Second thought privately about the woman who might look at that description and dismiss it as nothing remarkable. She would be completely wrong. The truth was that the chase ring could be upgraded 3 full levels. If the user managed to befriend a high-ranking blacksmith capable of performing ability upgrades on equipment, the chase ring would evolve into something monstrous. Specifically, after 3 levels of upgrading, the chance of triggering an extra attack would rise from 10% all the way to 25%. And of course, an item with such extraordinary hidden potential would never come cheap. Back in the days of Mabayon, it had cost 1.5 billion CL. In this world, the exact price was unknown, but regardless of what it was, he was determined to get his hands on one by whatever means necessary. As luck would have it, the sorcery convention was scheduled to begin on the very last day of their exchange program. Second was aware that as a foreigner who had apparently found grimoires to be a novelty, going all out using the raptor and coeurl forms during the competition would make certain people very suspicious of him. But as long as they made a swift exit immediately afterward, he was fairly confident they could manage without too much trouble. The day before the sorcery convention arrived, Second asked Main whether he planned to attend. Main explained that as the second prince, he was obligated to participate, and then asked whether Second would be attending as well. Second said yes, which caused Sylvia to spit out her drink in pure surprise. She immediately told him she had known nothing about that. Second remarked that her reaction was exactly what he had expected, and then explained simply that it was because he had never mentioned it to her. Main let out a heavy sigh beside them. Second noticed the sigh and asked Main whether something about the convention was bothering him. Main explained that his older brother would be present the following day. Second looked at him directly and asked plainly whether he meant the first prince and whether Main had some difficulty with him. Main quickly said it was not that simple. He clarified that he simply was not good with his brother. His older brother was someone who valued talent above all else, and because Main's own strength lay entirely in sorcery, his older brother, whose forte was swordsmanship, looked down on him greatly and called him weak. On top of that, even without intending to, his older brother saw him as a rival in the contest for the crown and therefore viewed him as a threat. Although his brother was officially coming the next day as the commander of the First Chivalric Order to observe the event, Main was certain that his real purpose was to humiliate him in front of everyone gathered there. Second absorbed everything Main had said. He noted internally that the first prince was the commander of the First Chivalric Order, and from the sound of things, the first prince was not a good person at all. He glanced over at Sylvia, who had gone quiet. Something clicked into place. He understood now. The first prince must have been among the corrupt figures from the upper ranks of the Chivalric Order who had made Sylvia's life difficult, and being the commander made him the highest among them. Second turned back to Main and suggested that he could simply pretend to be sick and skip the convention entirely. Main shook his head and explained that his older brother would use that against him without hesitation, declaring publicly that even after attending an academy of magic, his weak and cowardly younger brother did not have the nerve to show up at a sorcery convention. Second thought to himself that being a prince was a genuinely painful existence. Sylvia broke the quiet that followed, addressing Second in a casual but deliberate tone. He asked her what was on her mind. She told him that she had acquired the Coeurl form that very morning. Second was genuinely caught off guard. He asked her in disbelief whether she meant that morning, and noted that he had heard nothing about it. Sylvia gave him a small smirk and pointed out simply that it was because she had never mentioned it to him. In exactly the same way, he had never mentioned his plans to enter the convention. Meanwhile, Iko sat beside them, completely absorbed in eating her food and unbothered by the whole exchange. The following day, the sorcery convention arrived. Second sat in his seat with a focused and serious expression. Nearby, a group of students were talking among themselves. One mentioned that while there was apparently a ring being offered as the prize, he had never heard of it before. Another said that the previous year had been the 50th anniversary of the convention, but it had not seemed like a particularly significant occasion. A third added that the number of participants had been dropping and the rules had been revised, suggesting the whole event was in decline. Second listened to them and thought to himself that despite being aspiring sorcerers, none of them seemed to understand the true value of the chase ring. Without any upgrades, it was understandable that a 10% chance of an extra attack might seem unimpressive, but he could not fathom how people who studied sorcery would be unaware of ability upgrades and what they could do to an item like that. The conversation nearby shifted. One of the students mentioned that the first prince, Klaus, would apparently be spectating that year. Another smirked and said it was obvious why, gesturing toward Class A. The first one said he understood it was about the second prince. Someone else added that there were rumors the two brothers were not on good terms. Another student explained with a laugh that apparently the first prince regularly beat the second prince during what were called exhibition matches. A third burst into laughter and remarked that the first prince sounded impressive for it. Second listened and thought to himself that no matter where he went in that academy, the same picture kept being painted. The first prince against the second prince. Something about it felt unnatural. He found it difficult to believe that the source of the tension came from Main's side. There was a strong possibility that the first prince, Klaus, was actively working to shape how people perceived both of them. He wondered just how deep that hatred ran. Just then, Main arrived, and the students nearby immediately fell silent and looked away. Main excused himself as he approached. Second addressed him and asked whether he was going to be seated in the tournament. Main's face lit up when he spotted Second. He came over and confirmed that yes, he would be starting in the semifinals. Second said that if that was the case, they probably would not face each other until the final round. Main chuckled and said he would look forward to meeting Second there. The sorcery convention was being held in a tournament format with a total of 7 participants. Main was placed at the far left of the bracket while Second was placed at the far right, meaning Main only needed to win one match to reach the final, while Second would need to win twice. There was, however, one significant thing Second had not thought to clarify beforehand. He called out to Main and asked him plainly what one actually did in a sorcery convention. The students sitting nearby nearly fell out of their seats at the question. Main stared at him in disbelief and pointed out that he had signed up without knowing something so basic. Second casually apologized and guessed that it probably involved attacking each other with sorcery until someone was defeated. Main immediately said that was completely wrong. Second tried again, guessing that maybe it was just regular combat. Main's voice rose even higher at that, demanding to know what had happened to the sorcery aspect of his previous guess. Main sighed deeply and then explained the actual rules. The convention was conducted using something called a competition crown, which meant that no one's life was ever in danger. The competition crown was an item primarily used in player versus player situations, and it allowed matches to be held with absolutely no real risk to either participant. Every piece of equipment, every skill, and every limitation had rules established for it in careful detail. The reason there was no genuine risk was that everything occurring inside a competition that used a competition crown was virtualized. A participant's HP and MP were virtualized, and any damage dealt or received existed only within that virtual framework. In an ordinary duel using a different kind of crown, conducted in reality with both participants' actual bodies, people naturally died when their HP reached 0. But with the competition crown, if HP hit 0, the match simply ended and everything returned to normal with no consequences whatsoever. Some people had dismissed it as something designed for those too afraid of real stakes, but other players have been genuinely fascinated by the freedom that the competition crown's detailed rule system provided. They had explored countless variations and invented entirely new kinds of competitions that were nothing like typical duels, and those formats had grown popular over time. Maine concluded his explanation by clarifying that for this particular convention, the one and only rule was that all attacks had to be performed using sorcery. Second heard the entire explanation and felt a clear and certain recognition settle over him. In his mind, the whole thing sounded exactly like a particular kind of game format he knew well, and not a flattering one. He kept the thought to himself. A short time later, it was Second's turn to compete. An announcer stood at the center of the arena and called out the third match. First-year Class A's Second against first-year Class F's team. Second looked across at his opponent. Just then, a loud cheer reached his ears from the crowd. It was Iko, waving her arms with great enthusiasm. So enthusiastically that she accidentally struck Sylvia with one of them. Iko turned to look at Sylvia with a completely unaware expression, having no idea what she had done. The referee then called for the competition crown to be activated. The arena was a circle with a radius of 50 meters marked out on the stage. Stepping outside its boundary meant an immediate loss. The referee raised his hand, called for both participants to ready themselves, and signaled the start of the match. Upon the referee declaring the commencement of the match, Dean immediately began incanting a spell, whereas Second maintained a completely still and tranquil stance. By carefully examining the distinct hue and intricate structural formation of the gathering sorcery, Second was able to discern that his opponent had chosen to channel the raptor form of wind magic. Second privately regarded his opponent's tactical decision as utter foolishness, reflecting upon the foundational mechanics of spellcasting forms. The basic OPOPO form functions as a standard direct strike. The raptor form expands into a widespread attack. The coeral form delivers a concentrated single-target blow. The fourth form serves as a devastating area of effect strike, and the ultimate fifth form inflicts massive, catastrophic damage across a wide radius. Crucially, the casting duration required for each corresponding form increases progressively in that precise sequence, moving from OPOPO to coeral, followed by raptor, the fourth form, and finally the fifth form. Because an incantation is instantly interrupted and shattered if the caster sustains a specific type of blow mid-cast. Relying on any sorcery with an incantation period equal to or longer than the raptor form is completely impractical during high-level competitive combat. This fundamental truth was universally understood by experienced fighters, leading Second to question whether Dean was deliberately mocking him or attempting an absurd display. He pondered whether Dean had succumbed to baseless rumors suggesting that Second possessed inferior magical capabilities. The thought that a novice would hold such contempt for the world's top-ranked combatant sparked a surge of quiet irritation within him. Determined to settle the matter, Second offered a faint, disdainful smile and advised Dean to brace himself. Stepping smoothly forward, Second raised his arm and summoned the fundamental OPOPO form of wind, causing a gentle breeze to rapidly condense around his palm. Simultaneously, Dean continued channeling his raptor form of wind, striving to gather the necessary magical density around his own hand. However, long before Dean's spell could reach completion, Second's swiftly cast wind strike surged across the distance, colliding directly with the unfinished magical structure and causing Dean's spell to completely dissipate into nothingness. Second smirked at the outcome, thoroughly aware of the unique physical properties that occur when opposing magical forces collide. By leveraging these precise mechanics, he had executed a defensive canceling technique that neutralized his opponent's offensive effort. Although taking a direct hit from such a technique inflicts a minor amount of splash damage on the attacker, the recovery delay following the execution of an OPOPO form is less than half that of the prolonged recovery period enforced by a failed raptor form. This vast difference in operational delay granted Second an overwhelming tactical advantage that vastly outweighed any slight trade-off in raw power. Dean gasped in sheer astonishment as his spell vanished into thin air. Second nonchalantly presented his opponent with a brutal choice, asking whether he preferred to be agonizingly worn down to death, or if he would rather perish pathetically while begging on his knees for mercy. As he posed the question, Second instantly initiated the cast for the coeral form of fire, causing vibrant flames to materialize atop his hand. Having attained the 5th rank in this specific skill line, Second benefited from a substantial 2-stage reduction in total casting time, while the final impact power was amplified to 300% of his converted intelligence attribute. Cold perspiration broke out across Dean's face as he shrieked in absolute terror, recognizing his impending doom. Before the words had fully left Dean's lips, Second unleashed the fire strike, sending a blazing sphere hurtling directly toward the target. Dean watched the approaching projectile in frozen panic until the strike connected, triggering a massive, thundering detonation that launched his body high into the air. An agonizing shriek echoed across the entire arena before Dean crashed heavily back down onto the hard ground. Internally, Second expressed mild self-reproach, realizing he had miscalculated the raw destruction of his spell. His original intention had been to leave his target with roughly 10% of his total vitality remaining so he could prolong the confrontation, but the output had proven far too severe. The referee, left entirely speechless by the sudden and overwhelming display of force, stood immobilized for a brief moment before finally regaining his composure to announce Second as the victor. Almost immediately following the conclusion of the bout, the magical energy saturating the field dispersed, restoring the grounds to their tranquil state as though no violent clash had transpired. Second cast a brief, indifferent glance toward Dean, who remained sprawled on the earth, trembling in horror and clearly having lost control of his bladder out of sheer fright. Turning away from the scene, Second casually strolled back toward his companions and nonchalantly declared his triumph. Iko immediately cheered with great enthusiasm, praising Second's exceptional strength. Second accepted the compliment as a matter of course, affectionately referring to her as an eccentric companion. Sylvia, however, watched the scene with visible anxiety, expressing concern that Second had acted far too recklessly and inquiring whether their defeated opponent would even survive such a blast. Second dismissed her worries as trivial, asserting that since his eventual ascension to the absolute pinnacle of the world was inevitable, such minor incidents were irrelevant. Furthermore, he reminded her that their stay would be brief, as they planned to execute a swift getaway the moment they secured the championship reward. Sylvia acknowledged the necessity of their escape plan, yet still urged him to exercise greater restraint in his actions. Second casually waved off her concern with a dismissive response, asking if she considered herself to be his mother. The unexpected comparison left Sylvia completely speechless, as she repeatedly muttered the phrase back to herself in total bewilderment. Meanwhile, Iko cheered him on once more, encouraging him to keep giving his all in the upcoming matches, to which Second offered an agreeable nod. As Sylvia remained rooted to the spot, lost in confused reflection over the maternal comment, the loudspeaker bellowed across the grounds, formally announcing the start of the next scheduled match. The official in charge shouted out the announcement for the second semifinal match, calling for the first-year student named Second from Class A to take on the fourth-year student named Keith from Class A. The winner of this specific battle would earn the right to advance to the final round and compete directly against Prince Main. The match official instructed both young men to get into their fighting positions and then gave them the official sign to start the duel. Without losing a single second, Keith ran forward toward his opponent in a fast rush, whereas Second simply stood his ground with a calm and peaceful attitude. As he watched his opponent move, Second thought to himself that this older student actually possessed a fair amount of practical understanding about combat. In a tournament setting that only allows the use of magic spells among medium-level students, the end result of a match is almost always decided by whichever fighter manages to perform the very first action. Because of that basic fact, choosing to fight mainly with the OPOPO spell form, which naturally has the quickest casting time of all, was clearly the smartest choice a person could make. Acting immediately, Second used the OPOPO form of wind magic. Seeing this action, Keith stopped his forward movement right away and performed the exact same spell. Swirling currents of wind gathered in the hands of both fighters, and they threw their magic attacks directly at each other at the exact same moment. Second realized in his mind that the fight was now going to turn into an endless draw. From this moment on, both of them would simply continue to cast their magic at the same time, but because the spells were launched almost simultaneously, the attacks would crash into each other in midair and cancel each other out completely, bringing the situation back to the starting point every single time. This was a very clear flaw in the official rules of the contest, and it was one of the big reasons why he had long ago decided that this whole thing was a terribly made game. Second let out a quiet sigh of boredom. It was certainly true that if this were a battle between total beginners, holding a draw like this would be considered a very fine achievement. Unfortunately for Keith, however, the person he was standing against on the field was the former number 1 ranked player in the whole world. While they maintained their equal position, Keith called out to Second and requested that he give up the match voluntarily, promising that he would give him a proper reward in return. Second felt a little bit surprised by this proposal and asked him why he should give up. Keith answered that he simply could not permit Second and Prince Main to engage in a battle against each other. When Second asked for a clearer reason, Keith explained that his goal was to let Prince Main win this current round, so that Main could later take part in a friendly match against Prince Klaus. Second questioned Keith as to why he was sharing such private plans with him. Keith answered back that Second was not important enough to deserve an explanation, and that he should simply accept defeat without complaining. Second then asked if Keith was talking like this because he was afraid that Second would defeat both Prince Main and the first prince. Keith denied that reasoning, explaining instead that only a direct match between Prince Klaus and Prince Main would hold any true meaning or value for their goals. Second fixed his eyes on Keith with a very sharp stare and stated that Keith was essentially bringing dirty political games right onto the fighting ground. Keith replied that if they just kept fighting like this, they would never be able to finish the match anyway. Second narrowed his eyes, coming to the firm conclusion that Keith had likely been brought in specifically to help Prince Main reach the final stage of the tournament. He reasoned that Keith was definitely one of Klaus's followers. Under the fake excuse of a friendly exhibition match, Klaus intended to beat up Prince Main right in front of all the watching spectators. The quiet rumors that people had been talking about back in the waiting room were not wrong after all. As expected, Second felt very unhappy about this entire arrangement. But what truly annoyed him was not just the political trickery happening behind the scenes. It was the fact that Keith was trying to make a deal with him right in the middle of a draw, foolishly thinking he could actually convince Second to give up and lose on purpose. That arrogant belief was what bothered Second more than anything else. Second asked Keith if he truly believed that things would go so smoothly for him in real life. Keith ground his teeth together in anger and shouted out that any effort Second made was completely useless. At that exact moment, their wind spells crashed into each other in midair once again and vanished. Second immediately changed his approach and cast the Opio form of fire magic, and Keith responded instantly by performing the exact same fire spell. Second acknowledged in his mind that Keith was actually quite skilled to be able to counter his movements so fast, and he knew that as long as they stayed in this specific routine, the battle would truly never reach an end. However, that stalemate was only real if they stayed strictly within the normal boundaries of the situation. A light smile slowly spread across Second's face. He remarked out loud that since this was such a good opportunity, he would show everyone what real, top-level fighting actually looked like. Keith gasped in total shock and cursed under his breath as he realized something unexpected was happening. Second suddenly called forth his massive longbow directly into his waiting hands. Everyone watching the match must have been deeply confused about how he was able to bring out a physical weapon like that inside a tournament that was strictly limited to magic spells. However, by the time anyone even realized what was taking place, it was already far too late for anyone to stop him. Second called out to Sylvia, telling her to pay close attention to what he was about to do next. Sylvia watched the scene unfold with great surprise written across her face. Second then pulled back his bowstring and shot out a powerful arrow that was completely wrapped in massive, roaring flames. Magic archery is another excellent method of attack that makes use of sorcery, and it is the second main reason why this whole system is such a terribly designed game. On that note, magic archery works by setting sorcery directly onto the bowstring instead of a physical arrow, meaning that it does not actually use any real arrow at all. Keith ground his teeth together in complete frustration, completely unable to find enough time to dodge the fast incoming attack. Just like that, the bright flames engulfed his entire body. Slowly, the thick fire faded away into the air, and Keith staggered heavily from the heavy damage he had taken before quickly taking a few steps back to keep his balance. Second questioned Keith, asking if this outcome was truly the first prince's original goal all along. Keith was completely stunned into silence by the question. Seeing that shocked reaction on his face, Second realized in his private thoughts that a tournament where the only allowed means of attack is basic sorcery is clearly a terrible game. It is precisely because of those limited rules that complete stalemates can so easily happen. Prince Klaus must surely possess some kind of special fighting technique to easily break through those stubborn stalemates. Second felt fairly certain that Noir had mentioned before that Noir specialized mainly in swordsmanship. Chances were very high that Prince Klaus was actually using magic swordsmanship instead. As long as Prince Klaus held that powerful trump card inside the tournament, Prince Klaus would never lose a single fight to Main. Second was totally sure that Prince Klaus could easily poke Main full of painful holes without facing any kind of payback or defense. It was just like the unfair competition he was currently fighting in right now. Second remarked out loud that people who use such cowardly tactics ought to experience the exact same treatment firsthand so they could finally realize how truly foolish they were being. He pulled back the heavy string of his longbow once again and cast another magical spell directly into it to take the place of a regular arrow. Inside his mind, he carefully organized the specific combination of abilities he was about to use. First, he would lock onto and secure his moving target by using the skill called Night Archery. Next, he would greatly increase the overall strength of the attack by applying the skill known as Silver General Archery. Finally, he would massively boost the heavy physical impact of the shot by infusing it with the choral form of earth magic. This entire attack was an advanced combination of 3 distinct skills used all at once. While Second was in the middle of casting this powerful spell, Keith immediately decided that his best option was to turn around and run away as fast as he could. Second called out a warning to him, saying that trying to run away was completely useless at this point. He let go of the top bowstring and shot the compressed magic directly at Keith. Heavy stones of solid earth struck Keith's body with immense force, instantly knocking him down onto the ground. The match referee stood completely frozen in shock for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered his composure and loudly announced to the entire arena that the victor of the match was Second. Meanwhile, the gathered audience stared at the battlefield with wide eyes before suddenly rising to their feet as one to shout and cheer at the top of their lungs. Second smiled warmly as he watched the massive crowd cheering loudly for his victory. Meanwhile, far away from the eyes of the public crowd, Keith offered a deep apology for his total failure. Klaus responded in a calm voice that it was completely fine, noting that while he would now need to alter his original plans, it seemed he had accidentally discovered a rather pretty gem of a fighter. Klaus added that, looking at the current situation, chances were very high that the man called Second would go on to win the whole tournament. Klaus reasoned that if he could successfully recruit Second to his side, his little brother would still end up in a very difficult predicament. Keith replied that the man in question was actually a rather powerful and dangerous enemy. Klaus responded by asking if Keith honestly believed that such a man could ever refuse a direct personal invitation from him, the high-ranking commander of the First Chivalric Order. Klaus stated that no such refusal was possible. Grinning widely, Klaus added that to think an ordinary magic academy had someone hiding within it who could perform complex combinations of sorcery meant he was completely right to attend the event in person. He concluded that the man would serve as a truly excellent pawn for his future plans. Keith chose to remain entirely silent in response. Meanwhile, back inside the main fighting arena, the referee loudly announced that they were now officially moving into the final match of the tournament. Main stepped onto the open field and commented to Second on how amazingly strong Second truly was, admitting that he had already felt a strong hunch that this was the case. Second answered back by saying he was sorry for keeping his true strength hidden for so long, asking if Main now held any deep scorn or bad feelings toward him because of it. Main smiled very brightly and replied that there was absolutely no way he felt that way, stating that he had actually come to like Second even more than before. Second then told him that if that was truly the case, Main should make sure to take him directly to the royal palace the next time they had a chance, because Second really wanted to read through the fourth form spell book stored there. Main answered right away that he would obviously do that for him. Main then added in a slightly hesitant manner that he would do it, but only in exchange for a specific favor regarding their relationship. Before he could finish his thought, the referee suddenly interrupted their conversation and loudly instructed both fighters to get completely ready, then gave the official command for them to begin the final match. Immediately upon hearing the signal, the expression on Main's face turned completely serious. Both Second and Main cast the OPOPO form of wind magic at the exact same moment. Second noted in his private thoughts that it was only natural, but he had no intention of using his magic archery technique here. He felt that bending the competition rules like that would be disrespectful toward an opponent who could only rely on standard sorcery, and besides that, winning in such a manner simply held no real fun or satisfaction for him. Main narrowed his eyes with intense focus and patiently waited for the perfect opening to launch his next strike. Second quietly observed his opponent, expecting that Main would simply cancel out the incoming spell and reset the battlefield back to square one once again. However, that expectation was shattered almost immediately. Second's eyes widened slightly in surprise as he watched Main deliberately cancel his own active spell cast mid-motion. A powerful gust of wind wrapped heavily around Main's body as Second's wind attack struck him directly. Second realized right away that his opponent had forcefully altered his own casting timing to gain a tactical advantage. At that exact moment, Main immediately began casting another spell without delay. Second analyzed the action in his mind, recognizing that while a caster spell will certainly be interrupted if they are hit while actively incanting, starting a new incantation in the middle of taking damage allows the spell to go through without being broken. Main quickly channeled the choral form of wind magic. Second reacted instantly and cast his own spell to counter the incoming force. A massive, brilliant flash of blinding light erupted in the air between both combatants. Because Second possessed a significantly higher skill rank than Main, his overall casting time was much faster. As a result, even though Second had started his incantation later than his opponent, both Main's and Second's choral form spells activated at the very same time, colliding violently in mid-air and canceling each other out completely. After both of the massive magic attacks vanished into thin air, Main remained standing on the spot with a totally dumbfounded expression across his face. Second looked over at him, and thought to himself that such a stunned look was something a player should never reveal during a serious player-versus-player duel, as it completely signaled to the opponent that their ultimate secret card had just been used and defeated. Second took a cautious step backward, reflecting internally on the fact that he had foolishly underestimated Main's capabilities. He had spent time lecturing others about the danger of making light of their opponents, yet he had fallen into that exact same arrogant trap himself. Main was fighting with absolute seriousness, and if Main was giving his all, the only respectful response was for Second to meet him with equal intensity. He decided to demonstrate the ultimate level of sorcery from Mobius Online, executing it with the full pride and dignity of a man who had successfully defended the prestigious title of Wise General 22 times in a row. Second called out to Main, telling him to watch closely, and then immediately began casting the choral form of fire magic. At that very same moment, Main channeled the choral form of wind magic, shouting out with all his strength that Second would not pass him. Second then launched his fiery attack directly toward Main while calculating the distance in his head. Through many years of intense battle experience, he knew intuitively that the target was situated just outside the effective impact range of the spell, a spatial awareness so deeply ingrained in him that he did not even need to measure the distance to be completely certain. Furthermore, he had not actually prepared this specific choral form of fire to serve as an offensive strike in the first place. Main stood completely stunned as he watched the oncoming blaze stop harmlessly in the air right in front of him instead of making direct contact. Looking past the flames, Main spotted Second already smoothly shifting into his next strategic movement. Main's eyes stretched wide in total shock as he stared at Second, unable to detect any visible magic circles being formed. Second noted aloud that magic could be utilized in this tactical manner as well. Inside his thoughts, he added that sorcery does not always need to be used for direct offensive damage, as it can also serve as a visual screen to completely obscure one's next action from the enemy's line of sight. As for that hidden follow-up move, the Raptor form was a wide area spread attack that required a long casting duration, but the actual magical force it produced upon activation was extraordinarily immense. Main instantly grew anxious and panicked as he sensed Second incanting once again through the heavy veil of fire. Second commanded the spell to invoke. In a single instant, huge jagged stones erupted wildly from the ground directly in front of Main, completely cutting off his view and blocking his path forward. Main's jaw dropped open in complete disbelief at the sudden wall. Second reflected on his choice, noting that raising a massive earthen barrier to strictly restrict an enemy's freedom of movement was a classic and respectable tactical application of magic. It represented the most fundamental basics of magical combat, and every serious fighter had everything to gain from mastering such techniques. Now that the trap was set, it was time to unleash his final finishing blow. Without a moment's hesitation, Second cast the choral form of water magic. Unable to dodge or escape the incoming strike behind the wall, Main could only stare with wide, shocked eyes as the powerful torrent hit him head-on, knocking him flat onto the ground in defeat. Main let out a disappointed sigh as he lay on the earth. Feeling a calm presence stepping closer to him, he raised his head and saw Second standing over him. After letting out a short, quiet laugh, Main openly admitted that he had lost the match. Upon hearing his opponent laugh off the defeat, Second's face darkened with intense anger. Meanwhile, the surrounding crowd in the arena erupted into loud, thunderous cheers to celebrate the end of the tournament. Second glared down coldly at the defeated prince and harshly asked him why he was laughing. Main froze where he lay, completely stunned and silenced by the dark fury in Second's voice. Stunned by the unexpected evaluation, Main offered a quiet counterargument, emphasizing the immense power and skill that Second possessed. In response, Second immediately rejected the praise, clarifying that had Main managed to tap into at least the 5th class of his terrifying choral transformation, the outcome of their battle likely would have been a decisive defeat for Second himself. He admitted with genuine frustration that constantly walking the thin edge between victory and total collapse had subtly blinded him, causing him to foolishly make light of his opponent, which only proved how lacking his own true strength really was. Main remained perplexed, continuing to wonder aloud if his conqueror was simply being overly modest rather than genuinely weak. At that moment, Second's countenance turned drastically darker. His sharp gaze locked onto Main, and with an undeniable flare of anger in his voice, he demanded to know whether Main was not utterly furious at the situation. He pressed the point relentlessly, asking if losing so completely to someone who openly admitted to looking down on him did not burn a fiery hole inside his heart. Main lowered his eyes to the cold floor, weakly offering that he did not particularly feel any deep rage over the matter. Furious at the heartbreaking lack of drive, Second passionately commanded Main to stop deceiving his own soul, warning him sternly that failing to feel righteous anger in this exact critical juncture would permanently cement his fate as a pushover for the rest of his natural existence. Main fell completely silent under the weight of those brutal, accurate words, desperately searching his mind for something to say. Before the conversation could deepen further, Prince Klaus arrived on the scene with slow, deliberate applause. The first prince offered extravagant praise towards second, loudly admiring his astonishing level of perception and keen insight. Turning toward his younger brother, Klaus remarked disdainfully that his foolish sibling completely lacked that vital spirit, noting how he had relentlessly tried to hammer that exact wisdom into the boy's head time and time again without any success. Second merely cast a cold, detached side glance at the royal intruder. Prince Klaus paid no mind to the chilly reaction and enthusiastically continued his speech. Having caught a thrilling glimpse of Second's extraordinary martial abilities and remarkable intelligence, Klaus proclaimed that he was granting Second special authorization to join his esteemed ranks, offering him a prized opportunity to study high-level leadership directly alongside the prince himself. The surrounding spectators gasped in sheer astonishment, thoroughly stunned by the magnitude of such a sudden and grand royal bestowal. Deep inside his own mind, Second swiftly calculated the massive implications of this sudden proposal. Being brought under the personal guidance of Klaus, the supreme first prince would effortlessly secure him a guaranteed high-ranking position within the elevated upper echelon of the elite First Chivalric Order. Furthermore, once Klaus inevitably ascended the throne as the supreme king of the realm, Second would be absolutely guaranteed an even greater promotion into ultimate political and military power. He recognized with total clarity that this was an unbelievable, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that almost anyone else in the kingdom would eagerly die for. However, Second was equally aware of the darker side of the golden ticket. To openly reject such a magnificent personal invitation from royalty was functionally equivalent to declaring to the whole kingdom that he was making a permanent, deadly enemy out of Prince Klaus. Everyone standing in the vicinity firmly believed that no rational individual in their right mind could ever dare to refuse such an overwhelming offer. But Second was far from a normal individual. Without a single trace of hesitation, he looked the proud prince directly in the eye and delivered a calm, firm, and unequivocal refusal. A wave of profound shock rippled through the gathered crowd at the sheer, reckless, bold decline of the grand royal offer. Prince Klaus ground his teeth together in disbelief, his pleasant demeanor instantly evaporating as he coldly demanded the audacious fighter to speak again. Unfazed, Second plainly repeated his complete rejection of the invitation. The prince's face twisted violently into a contortion of intense rage and injured pride. Internally, Second remained completely unbothered, as he had fully anticipated this exact chain of events from the very beginning. Because he had intervened and prevented Klaus from brutally beating Mane into the ground earlier, he had logically deduced that the opportunistic first prince would eventually approach him directly to attempt a recruitment. After all, Klaus was the ultimate mastermind controlling that remarkably dubious chivalric order from behind the scenes. Attempting to exert his authority, Klaus issued a menacing demand, asserting his belief that deep down, Second surely desired to join his glorious ranks. Second calmly clarified the reality of the situation, revealing that prior to the commencement of the duel, he had already established a strict binding promise with Mane to accompany the second prince directly to the royal palace immediately following the match. Mane's eyes widened in sheer astonishment upon hearing this sudden revelation. In his quiet thoughts, Second chuckled at the sheer tactical genius of his own statement. By publicly declaring this pre-existing agreement, he was explicitly signaling to the entire audience that he was already officially affiliated with the faction of the second prince. A concrete arrangement had indeed been established with Mane just minutes prior, and the official referee, standing mere paces away, was fully available to serve as an undeniable legal witness to the fact. Prince Klaus turned his dark, terrifying gaze toward the trembling referee, demanding a firm and immediate confirmation of the claim. Caught under the terrifying weight of royal pressure, the terrified referee nervously nodded his head in complete agreement. Prince Klaus ground his teeth together once more, forced to bitterly accept the inescapable legal reality. Because an official contract had already been formally established between Mane and Second, any aggressive attempt by Klaus to step in and recruit the warriors served as a glaring, public act of illegal headhunting. Even with his absolute authority as the first prince of the kingdom, blatantly ignoring such a prior commitment represented a severe, undeniable breach of noble etiquette. Straining to control his volcanic fury, Prince Klaus spoke in a tone utterly dripping with suppressed rage, expressing that the circumstance was profoundly unfortunate. He coldly stated that Second would simply have to demonstrate his total devotion to Mane from this moment forward. Without waiting another second, the enraged first prince turned on his heel and abruptly departed the area. Once the terrifying prince was safely out of earshot, Mane turned towards Second, his eyes shining brightly with overflowing admiration and newfound devotion. Observing the sudden emotional shift, Second groaned internally, realization dawning on him that the young prince had already completely forgotten the harsh, valuable lesson he had been trying to teach him just moments ago. Deciding not to waste any more time, Second firmly announced that it was time to immediately resume their harsh educational session. He formally instructed Maine to continuously battle against him without rest until the timid young prince finally tapped into a genuine sense of deep, burning outrage. Maine gasped loudly in complete horror and surprise at the cruel directive, desperately begging his formidable opponent to show him some mercy, insisting that there was absolutely no possible scenario where he could ever hope to defeat someone as insanely strong as Second. Second sternly scolded the foolish mindset, pointing out that this exact sniveling, defeatist attitude was precisely the fatal flaw that desperately needed to be eradicated from Maine's personality once and for all. He pointedly reminded the boy that this cowardly weakness was the very reason Prince Klaus felt comfortable openly calling Maine a pathetic, weakling, foolish little brother in front of the entire kingdom. Maine offered a gentle complaint at the harsh remark, observing with a light-hearted sigh how extraordinarily strict Second was being with him, before warmly pointing out that Second was acting almost like a protective older brother to him. Second instantly rejected the comparison, telling the young prince not to lump them together so carelessly. He brought his hand down in a light, affectionate fist onto the top of Maine's head, softly calling him an idiot while clarifying that the only reason he cared enough to press him so hard was because they were genuine friends. Overwhelmed by the unexpected warmth of those words, tears immediately swelled in Maine's eyes, and a bright, joyful smile spread across his face as he enthusiastically agreed to keep pushing forward. Meanwhile, marching down the grand corridor on his way toward the headmaster's office, Prince Klaus completely abandoned his composed demeanor, roaring out in a fit of violent rage at the unbearable humiliation he had suffered. He cursed his foolish younger brother under his breath, his eyes burning with fury. Reaching the entrance, he slammed the heavy wooden doors open with incredible force, angrily demanding to know if Paula Memento was present inside. The headmaster, Paula, calmly rose from her desk at the sudden intrusion, gently urging the furious royal to compose himself and regain his calm. Klaus paid no heed to her soothing words, shouting at her to shut her mouth and immediately hand over every single piece of information the Academy possessed regarding the unbearable wretch known as Second. Responding without delay, Paula quickly began rummaging through the contents of her desk drawers to retrieve the requested records. Unable to contain his impatience, Klaus loudly demanded the documents, snatching the papers directly out of Paula's hands the moment they appeared. He rapidly scanned the lines of text written across the pages, his expression darkening with every passing second until he let out another loud gasp of intense frustration. He slammed his hand down, angrily questioning why the report was so utterly bare, pointing out that it contained nothing more than a mundane summary of Second's basic daily activities while attending the academy. Paula serenely explained the limitation, informing the prince that Second was an individual shrouded in deep mystery, adding that even his supposed homeland, the distant island nation of Zipong, remained a complete unknown to the rest of the world. Klaus's face contorted into a mask of pure indignation at the dead end. Utterly furious, he cursed loudly, throwing the useless stack of papers high into the air, letting them scatter across the room as he turned on his heel and stormed out of the office in a cloud of rage. Paula was left standing in complete silence amidst the quiet room. After a quiet pause, she bent down and carefully gathered the fallen pages from the floor. She quietly murmured to herself that the rumors regarding Prince Klaus's explosive hot temper were certainly accurate, before turning her thoughts back to the mysterious student. Gazing at the scattered records, she concluded that she would definitely need to conduct a far deeper investigation into the true background of the enigmatic young man named Second. In his mind, after receiving the coveted chase ring as his reward for victory, they made a swift exit and left the grounds of the Royal Academy of Magic far behind them. In this manner, his overall plan for acquiring basic sorcery was successfully accomplished for the time being. Now he simply needed to focus on mastering the 4th and 5th forms at some point in the future, and his ultimate preparation would be entirely complete. Turning his attention back to his companions, Second formally addressed the group, announcing that he was about to lay out their next major operational objective. Iko and Sylvia immediately stood straight, listening with undivided attention as he spoke. Second detailed that, moving forward, their primary focus would be dedicated entirely to grinding for experience points inside local dungeons. He explained that they would continue their deep explorations until Iko, in particular, managed to successfully reach the intermediate skill tier. Internally, Second reasoned that given their present circumstances, elevating the overall average level of their core combat abilities took absolute priority over everything else. Therefore, starting from that very day, they would be directing all of their daily energy and attention towards systematic dungeon crawling for the foreseeable future. Sylvia nodded in agreement, asking if their destination would once again be the familiar Royce dungeon. Iko bounced on her feet with bright excitement, cheerfully echoing the word dungeons with boundless enthusiasm. However, Second clarified that they would not be returning to Royce, revealing that they were stepping up to a second-ranked dungeon instead. He announced that their new target for exploration would be the treacherous underground halls of Limped Fath. Sylvia grew somewhat hesitant at the mention of a higher rank, contemplating the dangers, but Iko eagerly accepted the proposal without a single second of doubt. Second went on to explain the unique mechanics of their chosen destination, noting that Limped Fath Dungeon featured a noticeably low monster spawn rate, with the resident creatures possessing exceptionally high defensive stats paired with relatively weak offensive output. This specific balance made it an ideal training ground for polishing their group coordination and tactical synergy. Furthermore, he highlighted that the formidable rock shell shield was a guaranteed drop from the dungeon's apex boss, the Rock Tortoise, making it the absolute perfect piece of protection for Iko to eventually equip. Hearing this, Sylvia processed the information thoughtfully before suddenly catching herself in deep confusion. She questioned the mention of a heavy shield, wondering aloud why such a massive piece of defensive gear was being designated for a small girl like Iko. Gently placing his hand upon Iko's head, Second patiently explained that Iko possessed an extraordinary natural aptitude for taking on the vital role of drawing monster aggression and shielding the party on the front lines. Because of this inherent talent, he proposed that they spend the day actively raising and refining her specialized shield arts. Iko gave a firm, confident nod, acknowledging the directive with absolute trust. Panicking at the absurd mental image, Sylvia waved her arms frantically, desperately calling out for Second to hold on and rethink his terrifying plan. Completely ignoring her rising panic, Second smiled warmly down at Iko, pointing out that even with a sturdy shield, there would still be dangerous moments where she would inevitably take direct damage from vicious strikes. Therefore, to properly prepare for those painful emergencies, he suggested that she should also learn a reliable suite of divine recovery sorcery to heal herself in the heat of battle. Iko enthusiastically voiced her agreement to the plan. Sylvia shouted out in disbelief, fiercely questioning if Second truly intended to throw such a young, innocent, and delicate girl directly into the meat grinder of the frontline defense. Second casually brushed off her deep concern, reassuring her that Iko would adapt quickly and become completely indomitable before she even realized it. Sylvia protested that his dismissive answer failed to address the core problem, but Second simply signaled for them to move out, declaring that it was time to begin their preparation. Their first stop brought them straight into the local armor shop. Browsing through the available inventory, they selected a massive, heavy iron shield that stood just as tall as Iko herself. Because the shop lacked any standard body armor that could properly fit Iko's small stature, they were forced to purchase a set of high-grade, specialized small-sized equipment instead. The total cost for her complete defensive gear summed up to a staggering 4 million CL, making her personal outfit far more expensive than even Second's own high-end equipment. With their purchases completed, they made their way over to the grand shelves of the Royal Library. Once inside, Second carefully guided Iko through the ancient texts, enabling her to successfully absorb and unlock both the pawn shield art and the spear shield art skills. Satisfied with her swift progress, Second declared that their next stop would be the sacred church grounds, where they would inspect the holy grimoires dedicated to basic healing magic. Stepping inside the serene atmosphere of the church, Second approached the officiating staff, requesting access to the specific recovery minor grimoire required to master introductory recovery sorcery. A polite nun nodded gracefully, instructing them to follow her before presenting the sacred text directly to the young girl. Iko took the heavy book into her hands and read through its holy passages with careful focus. Upon finishing the text, a flash of light confirmed her success, and she officially acquired the basic healing ability, Recovery Sorcery, Recover Minor. Second smiled, noting that with their preparation successfully completed, it was finally time for them to take their leave and hit the road. In his internal thoughts, Second mapped out the upcoming journey, noting that traveling 4 hours on horseback from the bustling capital city, followed by a short 30-minute trek past the quiet agricultural settlement, known as Farming Town Piho, would bring them directly to the entrance of Limped Fath Dungeon. Following the road, the party safely arrived at Farming Town Piho, resting up for the long descent. Early the next morning, as a new day dawned, they officially crossed the threshold and began their systematic exploration of the underground labyrinth. For the initial 2 to 3 weeks of their campaign, they advanced through the dark corridors at a relaxed, deliberate pace, prioritizing Iko's hands-on training and skill acquisition above all else. Under Second's guidance, Iko effortlessly mastered almost all of the primary shield art techniques he wanted her to learn, successfully acquiring 4 out of the 5 core styles, with only the elusive bishop shield art remaining unlearned. The versatile capabilities of her newfound martial techniques proved to be incredibly effective in combat. The foundational pawn shield art granted standard, highly reliable physical protection against basic attacks. The offensive spear shield art allowed her to execute a precise counter, deflecting incoming blows while simultaneously piercing back through the attacker with reflected force. The crowd-controlling knight shield art provided absolute physical deflection while exerting a heavy knockback effect that sent aggressive foes tumbling backward. Finally, The formidable gold general shield art expanded her defensive range to cover surrounding allies, deploying an area-wide barrier that repelled multiple incoming threats with powerful kinetic knockback. As several more days passed in constant combat, marking roughly their 10th comprehensive run through the deep levels of the dungeon, Iko's battle presence began to undergo a dramatic transformation. She no longer looked like an inexperienced beginner, but instead started to clearly distinguish herself as a true, dependable paladin on the battlefield. This growth was put on full display when a fierce dungeon monster launched itself violently through the air directly toward her, only for Iko to smoothly step forward, plant her feet, and effortlessly raise her massive shield to completely absorb the impact without giving up a single inch of ground. Sylvia watched the intense confrontation from a short distance away, her face filled with anxiety as she shouted out to Iko, nervously asking if the young girl was truly all right after taking such a heavy blow. However, Iko showed not a single trace of struggle or pain, calmly turning her gaze towards Sylvia with a quiet, curious tilt of her head. Sylvia blinked in absolute confusion, completely caught off guard by the total lack of damage. Observing the interaction, Second noted that thanks to the rapid progression of her shield arts, Iko's base health pool and physical endurance had risen considerably over their recent dungeon runs. Sylvia let out a breath, quietly accepting the surprising explanation. Watching Iko stand firm on the battle line, Second silently recognized that she was steadily evolving into an exceptionally promising tank for their party. He reasoned that with her foundational attributes now sufficiently raised, the time had finally come for her to tackle the mastery of the elusive bishop shield art. Iko let out another soft sound of curiosity, sensing that a major test was about to begin. Deciding that the momentum was ideal, Second led the group deeper into the dark caverns, pushing all the way toward the deepest chamber where the dungeon boss resided. The formidable final boss of Limped Fath Dungeon was a gigantic creature known as the Rock Tortoise. The massive beast boasted an astronomically high defense stat, though its overall physical attack power remained relatively modest. Turning to face Iko before stepping into the boss arena, Second asked if she fully understood the assignment, instructing her to execute her defensive skills precisely according to his real-time commands to protect the party. He warned her that even if they performed every action flawlessly, chipping down the boss's massive health bar would still require roughly 15 minutes of non-stop concentration, and a single mistake would force them to reset the entire ordeal from scratch. He looked her in the eye and asked if she could handle such an intense burden. Iko's expression turned instantly serious, and she gave a firm, unwavering nod, declaring that she could definitely do it before boldly stepping forward into the arena. With a final nod from Second, the battle officially commenced, placing Iko face to face with the colossal rock tortoise. Deep inside his mind, Second reviewed the extraordinarily strict hidden requirement needed to unlock the Bishop Shield art. To acquire the high-tier skill, a user was required to utilize their shield arts to completely block 100 consecutive incoming attacks from a boss monster stronger than themselves without breaking the streak. The absolute core bottleneck of this task lay in the requirement of complete negation, meaning that taking even a single point of chip damage would instantly reset the counter to 0. Because of this harsh restriction, Iko's practical defensive options were severely limited. She would have to continuously execute precise counters, repelling incoming long-range piercing strikes using the Spear Shield art, or constantly executing perfect parries to knock the monster back using either the Knight Shield art or the Gold General Shield art. In combat mechanics, a parry was a precise phenomenon triggered by synchronizing a defensive motion perfectly with the exact instant an enemy's attack landed. A successful execution completely negated all incoming damage while inflicting a slight kinetic knockback onto the attacker. To Second, executing this strategy transformed the high-stakes battle into a strict rhythm game, one that was notoriously painful and exhausting to master. However, once an individual mastered the exact timing, they could continuously negate all incoming force, granting them an overwhelming tactical advantage in any encounter. The Rock Tortoise reared back and launched its initial assault, prompting Second to immediately begin shouting precise tactical commands in real time. He called out the required defensive forms in rapid succession, shouting for her to deploy the Knight style, followed immediately by the Gold General, back to the Knight, and then transitioning into the Spear style. He carefully guided every single one of her movements to match the rhythm of the giant beast's incoming strikes. Although the Rock Tortoise attacked in a relatively simple and predictable pattern, getting the precise parry timing right on a first attempt was notoriously difficult for any warrior. Suddenly, a slight lapse in timing caused Iko's defensive stance to be broken, allowing an attack to slip past her shield. Both Second and Sylvia watched closely from the sidelines. Second pointed out that her reaction had been just a fraction of a second too slow on that last attempt, asking her if she still possessed the stamina to keep going. Iko nodded her head firmly, declaring with complete resolve that she could still fight. Without a moment's hesitation, she cast her recovery minor spell to instantly patch up her minor injuries, stepped right back into the danger zone, and bravely faced the giant rock tortoise once more. From that intense moment onward, the group remained locked in a grueling trial against the massive boss for nearly 2 full hours. Through sheer determination and endless repetition, Iko eventually mastered the difficult timing, flawlessly completing the requirement and successfully acquiring the coveted Bishop Shield art. The conversation began as Second turned his attention towards Sylvia, asking if the time had finally arrived for her to begin learning magic archery. Sylvia fell quiet for a brief moment before confirming that she truly desired to master the art if it was within her capability. Second smiled warmly, reassuring her that she was more than capable and declaring that their training in magic archery would commence that very day. Sylvia expressed her enthusiasm, but the lively atmosphere was quickly interrupted as Iko stepped forward with a bright, expectant smile. Curious and eager not to be left out, Iko repeatedly inquired about her own role in the day's plans. Second pondered her question for a moment before explaining that they would be heading to a dungeon to test the condition of her Bishop Shield art. He noted that her specific task would involve defeating rock tortoises in hopes of acquiring the prized rock shell shield. Upon hearing this, Iko cheered with joy, observing her pure delight. Second inwardly reflected on how consistently cheerful she had been lately, musing that despite belonging to a cat-beast race, her temperament was entirely akin to that of a devoted and enthusiastic dog. Without further delay, Second signaled for the party to set off, and together they made their way to the dungeon. Upon entering the cold depths of the dungeon, Second instructed Sylvia that her immediate focus should be fulfilling the preliminary conditions required to combine the disciplines of archery and sorcery. Feeling the weight of the task, Sylvia nervously braced herself and acknowledged his instructions. In his mind, Second carefully calculated the requirements for unlocking the essential combination skill within the magic archery tree. To achieve this, a warrior was required to land the finishing blow using sorcery on 1,000 monsters that had first been whittled down to 25% or less of their maximum health using archery skills. Given her dedication, he estimated that she would easily fulfill this extensive quota within approximately a week's time. Turning his attention to Iko, Second instructed her to prepare her Bishop Shield art and initiate a surprise encounter against an approaching dungeon creature. Iko readily agreed and shifted into position. As a monster ambushed them from the shadows, Iko stood her ground, firmly planting her shield as the beast lunged forward with a fierce attack. Channeling her energy at the exact moment of impact, she unleashed the defensive technique known as Bishop Shield art. The resulting surge of power left both Sylvia and Iko herself utterly astounded. The underlying mechanics of Bishop Shield art granted a powerful property known as Strength and Defense, an effect that temporarily amplified the user's natural vitality stat while actively blocking strikes. Should an adventurer manage to elevate this technique to the prestigious 9th grade, it possessed the miraculous ability to bolster their defense by 600% of their base vitality. For a warrior whose build heavily favored maximum endurance, it represented a monumental wall of protection, capable of comfortably repelling even the most devastating strikes from boss-level entities. However, Second noted a crucial drawback to this magnificent technique, pointing out that its heavy cost rapidly drained the user's spirit points, meaning it had to be reserved strictly for dire situations requiring absolute defense. Looking down, Second was startled to see Iko trembling, sweat dripping from her brow as tears began to stream down her face. Concerned, he anxiously asked what was wrong. Iko choked back her tears and emotionally confessed that she was simply overwhelmed with happiness because she felt she could finally be truly useful to the group. Moved by her genuine sincerity, Second gently placed his hand on her head to comfort her. Realizing that the sheer utility and raw defensive potential of the Bishop Shield art had deeply touched the sensitive heart of the young girl. As their dungeon expedition continued, Sylvia triumphantly declared that she had successfully unlocked the target technique, officially acquiring the coveted magic archery discipline. Second approved of her swift progress and suggested they immediately put her new capability to the test using the advanced choral form. Sylvia agreed to the proposal, drawing her bowstring taut and bringing the tip of her arrow to bear on a nearby monster. Yet, despite her ready stance, a wave of hesitation washed over her, prompting her to pause and ask Second if he was truly certain about taking this step. Second affirmed his command without hesitation, prompting Sylvia to release the drawn arrow, weaving together the simultaneous execution of pawn archery, choral form of fire, and her newly mastered combination skill. The resulting projectile exploded forward with terrifying velocity, striking the monster full force and tearing a massive, gaping hole completely through its heavy torso. Second carefully analyzed the sheer magnitude of the impact. The choral form of fire she had invoked was operating at the 9th class rank, yielding a colossal critical damage output of 1,612 points. He evaluated this outcome as a highly respectable benchmark for immediate field use. In his tactical assessments, he recognized that if they were to eventually transition her baseline pawn archer discipline into the vastly superior castle or silver general ranks while further elevating her choral form mastery, This devastating strike would easily become their primary long-range line of defense. He made a mental note that he truly desired to see her push her limits and give her absolute best toward mastering this martial path. Meanwhile, Iko cheered with unbridled excitement at the spectacular display, praising Sylvia's incredible power. In stark contrast, Sylvia slowly sank onto the ground, completely drained and staring blankly ahead as she softly agreed that the power was indeed extraordinary. Later that evening, after returning from their exhausting dungeon journey, the group gathered inside the quiet comfort of their house. Sitting across from Sylvia, Second suddenly broke the calm silence by declaring with absolute gravity that he wanted to do it right now. Sylvia froze entirely, staring back at him in utter silence before shouting out in total shock, demanding to know why he was making such a sudden declaration without any warning. Second maintained a completely serious expression, reiterating his firm desire to proceed immediately at this exact moment. The two remained locked in an intense, silent glare. Panicking, Sylvia sputtered out a flustered protest, questioning whether it was far too early for such a step and desperately asking if they shouldn't spend time deepening their emotional bond and mutual relationship beforehand. Second, completely misinterpreting her flustered panic, firmly explained that he simply could not contain his overwhelming urge to get stronger as quickly as possible. Sylvia blinked in confusion, repeating the word strong as her entire face flushed into a bright, deep shade of crimson. A moment later, Second found himself sitting quietly with a clear, red handprint stamped plainly across his cheek. Holding up a newly acquired artifact, Second clarified his true intention, explaining that now that they had finally obtained the coveted chase ring, it was imperative that they use its power to elevate their combat capabilities. Realizing her massive misunderstanding, a deeply embarrassed and annoyed Sylvia looked away, begrudgingly acknowledging that his tactical reasoning was entirely correct. Second offered a quick apology for the confusion, pointing out that this enhancement process directly involved the further refinement of her precious flame wolf's bow as well. Sylvia turned her gaze back toward him, quietly listening as the discussion shifted toward their equipment. Second turned to Iko and mentioned that she would eventually acquire the rock shell shield as well, though he quickly brushed it aside as a minor detail. He then instructed her to listen attentively, emphasizing that strengthening equipment was a matter of extreme importance. To illustrate his point, he asked her how much damage she currently dealt using castle archery. Sylvia pondered the question for a moment before estimating that her attack power hovered around 3,000. Second immediately pointed out that if she were to upgrade the Flame Wolf's bow to its final enhancement stage, that figure would leap to 12,000 instead. Sylvia was completely taken aback by the revelation, astonished by the sheer magnitude of the increase and questioning if such a power boost was truly possible. Second confirmed the math, reiterating that combining her base damage with a fully upgraded weapon would quadruple her current damage output. Faced with the staggering fourfold increase, Sylvia acknowledged that if enhancement truly possessed such an incredible effect, its value could not be overstated. As Sylvia paused to contemplate the logistics of equipment upgrading, she began to raise a concern regarding the practical execution of strengthening gear. Before she could finish her thought, Second interrupted, realizing she had already caught onto the core obstacle standing in their way. He affirmed her implicit realization by confirming that to accomplish their goal, they would inevitably require the services of a skilled blacksmith. Sylvia then inquired about how he intended to secure one for their cause. Second outlined 4 distinct possibilities for acquiring a blacksmith, while Sylvia listened in silence to evaluate each path. The first option involved the 3 of them forming an official team and registering with the Adventurers Guild, where they could actively recruit new members. Second explained that gathering personnel as an established group issuing a recruitment call was far easier than attempting to recruit as isolated individuals. However, he also highlighted a major drawback, noting that there was no way to predict how long they would have to wait before chancing upon a capable blacksmith, nor was there any guarantee that a trustworthy candidate would ever approach them. Sylvia agreed with his assessment, noting that relying on chance through the guild sounded excessively difficult. Second then presented the second possibility, which involved searching through the population one by one to locate individuals possessing an inherent aptitude for blacksmithing and extending direct invitations to them. Sylvia immediately found the sheer scale of such a task exhausting, remarking that she felt like she would pass out just thinking about it. Second continued his explanation, acknowledging that while successfully discovering a raw talent offered the immense advantage of training a blacksmith completely from scratch according to their own preferences, the probability of encountering such an individual was lower than 1 in 10,000. Moving on to the third alternative, Second suggested directly inviting an active, established blacksmith to join their cause. Sylvia pondered this option, noting that while it seemed like the most realistic approach on the surface, it carried its own set of major complications. Second validated her reservation, explaining that the pool of viable prospects was extremely thin, because blacksmithing was such a highly lucrative and valued profession, Convincing a practicing craftsman to abandon their current livelihood and workplace to join people they had never met before was entirely unreasonable. Having eliminated the first three methods, Second declared that the fourth option was their most viable and likely path to success. Sylvia asked if he had conceived a clever strategy, prompting a brief silence between them before Second revealed his proposal to purchase a slave. Anticipating an immediate, explosive reaction from her, Second instinctively braced himself for an attack and fell silent. To his surprise, Sylvia reacted with calm consideration rather than anger, reflecting thoughtfully on the concept and noting that using a slave would indeed make finding a candidate straightforward. Confused by her calm demeanor, Second asked if she was genuinely not upset. Sylvia expressed confusion at his expectation, asking why she would be angry when his intent was simply to search for a slave with a specific talent for blacksmithing. She affirmed that it was a sound idea, particularly since visiting a slave market would allow them to freely inspect the statuses of the candidates without any difficulty. Inside his mind, Second felt a wave of relief that she had so easily given her approval. Given her status as a noble female knight, he had fully anticipated a furious outburst where she would accuse him of harboring inappropriate or violent motives straight out of a scandalous book before striking him. Since that dramatic reaction failed to materialize, Second promptly finalized their plan, declaring that they would travel back to the royal capital the following day to visit a slave merchant. Sylvia agreed to the plan without hesitation, but then suddenly suggested that Second should wear his rare outfit for the trip. Second pondered her suggestion internally, realizing that dressing in high-tier, expensive-looking attire would make him appear wealthy, which would naturally earn them superior service from the merchant. Agreeing that her suggestion was genuinely sharp, Second eagerly promised to get the outfit ready for their upcoming journey. In the royal capital of Vinstan, Iko, Sylvia, and Second arrived together at the Maurice Slave Company. Upon their arrival, they were greeted warmly by a man sporting a distinctive mustache who introduced himself as Philip, the president of the establishment. Philip was widely regarded as the most influential high-status figure in the surrounding region. Looking at the president's deferential response, Second realized that his strategy of wearing his rare, expensive attire had produced immediate and incredible results, granting them instant respect and elevated service. Addressing the president, Second clearly stated their objective, explaining that he was searching for a slave capable of blacksmithing and requesting permission to thoroughly inspect and analyze the candidate statuses. President Philip readily agreed, expressing that it would be an absolute honor, and immediately left to gather the potential candidates for their review. After a short period of waiting, the collection of prospective slaves was assembled before them. Observing the line of candidates, Second suddenly experienced a clear realization regarding why Sylvia had remained so calm when he had originally brought up the idea of purchasing a slave. He admitted to himself that the entire matter had simply been a total misunderstanding on his own part. He reasoned that because they were specifically seeking skilled blacksmiths, it was completely logical for the candidates to look the way they did. Nevertheless, hearing the word slave had initially raised his expectations toward finding young men, leading him to release a heavy, disappointed sigh. Seeing his hesitant reaction, President Philip politely inquired whether any of the assembled individuals met his standards. Second casually asked for a moment to review them, hiding the subtle wave of disappointment he felt upon discovering that every single candidate was a middle-aged man. Proceeding with his evaluation, Second began examining each candidate's status one by one to properly categorize them. In terms of ideal stat allocation for a top-tier blacksmith, he prioritized strength, dexterity, and luck, while also considering intelligence to be a valuable secondary attribute. He recognized that the optimal growth type to fulfill these conditions seamlessly was naturally the dedicated blacksmith class itself. Furthermore, because this blacksmith would be responsible for enhancing the equipment of someone striving to become the world's greatest warrior, Second held a firm standard that the chosen individual must possess innately superior starting capabilities. After a period of silent analysis, Second firmly concluded that none of the candidates present met his high expectations. The gathered slaves remained completely silent, while President Philip sincerely apologized for failing to provide a suitable option. The president then informed him that the only remaining individuals in his possession were classified as criminal slaves. Reflecting on the term criminal slave, Second pondered whether there was any meaningful operational difference between them and ordinary slaves, ultimately deciding that the distinction was irrelevant so long as the individual possessed exceptional blacksmithing capabilities. He instructed the president to show him those candidates as well. President Philip agreed to the request, explaining that because these individuals were designated as criminal slaves, they could not be brought into the main reception hall and would instead need to be viewed directly inside the inner slave chambers. Second acknowledged the policy and instructed Sylvia and Iko to wait behind in the main area, to which both nodded in agreement. As Second accompanied the president into the deeper quarters, he noted that the Maurice Slave Company appeared quite prosperous. The living conditions provided to the slaves were remarkably decent, with only a small handful displaying visible signs of despair. Arriving at the destination, the president introduced the criminal slave section, explaining that among the 33 current inmates, exactly one was a blacksmith. Second personally inspected the designated craftsman, but quickly rejected him, stating that he would not suffice. President Philip once again offered a sincere apology for his inability to meet the client's demanding requirements. However, as they prepared to turn back, Second noticed a specific room that appeared to be built with an extraordinary level of security. Curiosity piqued. He inquired about the person held behind such heavily fortified doors. President Philip hesitated briefly before offering to show him the occupant as an additional gesture of goodwill for the unsuccessful visit. Opening the smaller viewing door, the president revealed a young girl bound securely by a heavy chain around her neck. The president explained her backstory, revealing that she had been an assassin under the command of a duchess who was recently executed. Because her actions were carried out under absolute compulsion due to an unyielding slave contract, the authorities determined that she was not personally guilty of the underlying crimes, sparing her from execution and transferring her to his company instead. Observing the girl closely, Second noted her distinct physical traits and identified her as a dark elf. President Philip confirmed her identity, adding that while she possessed immense natural talent, the kingdom of Castal had bound her with a strict contractual clause preventing any hostility. As a result, her practical utility was limited solely to roles such as a domestic maid or personal servant. The president lamented that due to her dark elf heritage and these strict operational restrictions, no buyers had shown any interest in purchasing her, presenting an ongoing dilemma for his business. Analyzing the dark elf situation, Second pondered the implications of the restriction forbidding her from displaying hostility, realizing that an inability to launch attacks posed a massive operational limitation. At the same time, he found it puzzling that a strikingly attractive dark elf would receive no purchasing offers, assuming her physical appearance alone would generate massive demand. President Philip chimed in to validate his observation, lamenting that potential buyers constantly complained about the restriction, creating an ongoing headache for his business. Second reflected on the broader social context within the Kingdom of Castal, recalling that widespread discrimination against beast folk and active persecution of dark elves were deeply rooted cultural issues. He deduced that the government had likely enacted these strict contractual regulations as a legal measure to manage and restrict dark elf ownership. Consequently, in the current social climate, keeping a dark elf as a servant or companion was viewed as immensely disgraceful, completely suppressing market demand. Seeking concrete details, Second asked the president to display the dark elf's personal status sheet. As he began reviewing the information, the dark elf released a heavy, weary sigh. Second was immediately struck by the exceptional numbers presented before him, noticing first and foremost her insanely high dexterity value, alongside remarkably strong numbers in both strength and intelligence. He recalled that dark elves were traditionally designed as versatile, all-rounder characters capable of mastering swordsmanship, archery, and sorcery simultaneously, and her base statistics aligned perfectly with that foundational design. However, he was surprised to notice that her agility and luck attributes were also unusually elevated, prompting him to ask her directly about her current skill list. The dark elf answered plainly, listing her skills as swordsmanship, archery, string manipulation, and assassination. Everything instantly clicked in Second's mind as he processed her response. He recognized that her abnormally high dexterity attribute enhanced not only her magical sorcery capabilities, but also amplified the effectiveness of her string manipulation skill. Furthermore, her elevated agility directly supported the requirements of her assassination skill. Evaluating these distinct mechanical synergies, Second realized that her underlying growth potential could easily be redirected into an exceptional blacksmith development path. Without hesitation, he asked the president for her purchase price. President Philip was overjoyed by the prospect of finally closing a sale on the troublesome captive. At that precise moment, Second finalized his internal decision to purchase the dark elf criminal slave. The total transaction came out to 16 million CL. Second remarked silently to himself that acquiring a top-tier, highly promising blacksmith candidate at such a bargain price was almost absurd, jokingly reflecting that the world's economy must be on the verge of collapse. President Philip then announced that he would prepare the official slave contract documents. Second watched the preparations, reflecting on the mechanics of the slave sorcery spell utilized in the process. Having observed similar practices previously in Mabayon, he understood that a master and slave bound under slave sorcery were fundamentally incapable of taking any action that violated the explicit conditions recorded in the document. The contract did not merely punish violations after the fact. Rather, an inexplicable and absolute force actively prevented either party from attempting a breach in the first place. Although Second was well aware that various underhanded methods existed to bypass such magic without penalty, the basic system remained absolute for ordinary users. President Philip brought over the completed document and asked if the listed conditions met Second's approval. Caught off guard while lost in thought over minor technical details, Second realized he had not yet read a single line of the text. Reviewing the clauses, he observed that the bulk of the agreement contained standard boilerplate terms, essentially establishing that the master was required to treat the slave humanely while the slave was obligated to obey the master's directives. However, a single clause at the very bottom of the document caught his attention and sparked concern. Clause number 19 explicitly stated that the slave could not execute an attack against any human being under any circumstance. Second recognized the severity of this clause, realizing that if she were ever assaulted by a human, the restriction would render her completely unable to defend herself, leaving her open to continuous harm. Second asked President Philip if there was any possibility of altering or removing that specific clause. The president shook his head, explaining that because the restriction was mandated directly by royal decree, it was completely unchangeable. Accepting the inevitable, Second agreed to proceed with the transaction under the existing terms. President Philip expressed his gratitude, and the dark elf formally affixed her signature to the document. With the paperwork finalized, President Philip cast the slave sorcery spell, channeling the binding magic simultaneously into both Second and the dark elf. Upon completing the incantation, the president formally announced that the slave sorcery process was complete and expressed his deep gratitude to Second for the major purchase. With the transaction concluded, Second and the dark elf began walking back together through the hallway toward the building's main area. As they walked, Second turned to his new companion and inquired about her name. She responded flatly, stating that she did not have one. Attempting to make a lighthearted joke, Second casually replied that it was nice to meet someone named "I do not have one," as they continued heading back to the reception room. The dark elf stopped and clarified in a serious tone that she had meant she literally possessed no name at all. Second fell completely silent, internalizing the awkward moment as he realized that his deliberate joke had completely failed to land, leaving the dark elf looking back at him with an expression of total disgust. Reflecting on her direct and unbothered demeanor, Second acknowledged that despite her status as a slave, she possessed remarkable spirit and nerve. At the same time, he wondered about the harsh realities of her past, questioning what kind of life she must have led to not even possess a proper name. Turning to her, he noted that continuing without a name would make addressing her far too inconvenient, asking if she would mind if he assigned one to her. The dark elf gave her approval without hesitation, inviting him to proceed as he saw fit. Second paused to consider various options, letting his mind wander through her distinct physical traits. He took note of her dark elf heritage, her rich, chocolate-colored skin, and her striking violet hair. Connecting the vibrant purple shade of her hair with her appearance, he pondered the word violet repeatedly until a fitting title came to mind. Settling on a choice, he asked if she would accept the name Yukari. Closing her eyes, the dark elf bowed deeply in formal acceptance, stating that her name was now Yukari and politely offering her faithful service to her new master. Pleased with her response, Second offered a warm smile and formally introduced himself by name. He added that he would introduce her to the rest of his companions once they rejoined them, to which Yukari dutifully agreed.